Chapter 41. Rand and Taija's Excellent Adventure. Chapter text Chapter Roman 29. Rand and Taija's Excellent Adventure. Over the next couple of days, Taija could see Rand getting grumpier and more withdrawn. It was easy to work out why. Moiraine was cornering him at every opportunity and pushing her preferred course of action. She was left wondering whether she should intervene, although she wasn't sure what she could actually do to get Moiraine to stop trying to lead him around by the nose, short of severing her, putting her in a box, and delivering her back to Siwan to be her problem. Even that probably wouldn't work since Taija had no idea where Siwan's rebel Aes Sedai actually were. Perhaps if she could sneak a tracking web onto the woman next time she visited Falme. It was something to think about. Regardless, Taija's pondering was cut short one night when Rand knocked on her door. It was late, and she was fast asleep until her wards woke her, so she wasn't in the best mood when she poked her head out of the door. She'd been expecting some kind of emergency, but instead she was met with Rand's worried face. "Taija, can we talk?" she sighed internally. "Of course, Rand, come in." Taija opened the door wider and gestured to a chair. He immediately flushed bright red, looking everywhere except at her. It took Taija a second to realize he was embarrassed at her immodest shift. With a very much audible sigh, she grabbed a blanket to drape herself in. It was ridiculous, though. It was a knee-length nightgown, not a bikini. Once her modesty was suitably protected and Rand had calmed down, he started to talk. "I need your help, and you said you'd support me whatever I chose. I want to go to Tyr, but Moiraine simply won't leave me alone. I know you can get me there." He took a breath. "I want you to make a gateway for me to the city tomorrow, so that I can get away from all of this and settle things once and for all." Taija's heart broke a little for the poor boy. "Oh, Rand, I'm so sorry. However, I'm not going to help you go and get yourself killed." Anger flashed across his face, but she kept talking. "So I'll be going with you. You're absolutely not going alone to a strange city to break into an impenetrable fortress." "Nope." She sat back with a conclusive smile. Thinking about it, this worked well for Taija too. She was sick of Falme and really needed a distraction. "No, Taija, you can't come, it's too dangerous." Rand's protest was vehement. Taija tried to stifle an incredulous laugh, not entirely successfully. "You're trying to protect me. You've been having such a hard time recently. I can tell how hard you find it here sometimes, and the whole thing with you know." He shrugged, a bit embarrassed. "Oh, Rand, you really are such a nice boy. I hope you never change." Really was. Taija's voice hardened. "That being said, you're not going without me. I don't think anyone else will take you, and I am not letting a 19-year-old." He started to protest. Whatever, 20-year-old friend go off and get himself killed over some stupid prophecy. Eventually, Rand grumpily acquiesced and left Taija to what was left of the night. Instead of falling back to sleep and having to deal with yet more bad dreams, she started planning. Money shouldn't be too big a problem. She still had some left over from Siwan and had already engaged in a bit of discreet looting of what the Cinchan left behind in Falme, as had plenty of others she suspected. The big question was whether she was going to take anyone else, specifically the girls, Egwene and Elaine in particular. Nynaeve was old enough to make her own choices. Really, she should be leaving them with Moiraine and Siwan. They were in training to become Aes Sedai, after all. The question was threefold, though. Firstly, did she want to? Taija wasn't totally sure. They might well end up being liabilities, and she'd always preferred research to teaching. On the other hand, she'd grown rather fond of Egwene and Elaine. Even Nynaeve wasn't that bad, most of the time. Secondly, did she think they'd actually be safer with the rebel Aes Sedai? Taija wasn't sure. They'd be targets there, or targets with her, but her confidence in Siwan's ability to protect them when she had so many other problems wasn't particularly high. Thirdly, was it fair to take them away from their dream of becoming Aes Sedai with the White Tower? Taija might not have much respect for the modern Aes Sedai, but she got little to offer the girls herself. She thought on it for a while, and in the end she decided, unsurprisingly, that the only moral approach for her to take was to let the girls decide. She'd offer Alexei the choice too, but she already knew what he'd say. The next day Taija grabbed the three girls early in the morning. "I have something that I need to discuss with you." She spun a web against eavesdropping around the room, not inverting it for once so that they could see the web. Almost anything could be a teaching moment. "I'm going to be going to Tyr with Rand later today. It's short notice, but he needs to move, and he's decided that that's the best way forward for him. I'm willing to support him in that. Inevitable there were protests. You can't just let him run off and get himself killed because he feels obliged to fulfill a prophecy. He needs support. That may be true, Elaine, but he needs to decide for himself. We can give him advice, but we can't make his decisions for him. I'm not going to try to manipulate him into doing what other people want. Equally, I'm not going to let him run off and get himself killed, which is why I'll be going with him. Then we're coming too, declared Nynaeve. We're not going to let you get yourself killed either. The two of you need someone less wool-headed to keep you from doing something foolish. Taija raised her eyebrows at her, and she quickly muttered, "Sorry, Taija Sedai. You do realize that you should be staying with Moirin or going to Siwan, that if you come with me, the White Tower will likely see you as runaways, and you might never become Aes Sedai." This time Egwene spoke up. "We know, we've discussed it. If the worst comes to the worst, well, you said that 3 Aes Sedai could award the title. We figure that if you're the last Aes Sedai from the Age of Legends, Light Taija hated it when they called it that, then you can make new ones until there are 3. I'm not going to award you the title of Aes Sedai if that's what you think." Taija's voice was flat. "Oh no, of course not, but we want to be with you anyway, and you have so much to teach us." Egwene sounded suspiciously innocent. Taija chose not to engage with that. "So you all want to come?" They nodded. "Fine. We meet at the stables at midnight. Try to get some sleep before then, and please don't tell anyone else, especially not Moirin." Elaine hurried to find Matt. She didn't have much time, but if she was leaving for Tyr then, she needed to do something first. Frack, she was running late. She should not have helped him hide from Taija after that night. He had become much too good at avoiding any of them when he wanted to. Fortunately, she eventually remembered one of the inns that he liked. Not a horrible place like the one they had found Taija in, but certainly not a respectable establishment either. Spending more time with the bloody man had meant that she was becoming more familiar with Falmy's inns, and they had quickly lost their appeal. As Linny always said, see gold too many times and it starts looking like brass. Luckily, but predictably, when she walked into the inn he was there, sitting with a couple of men who looked like merchants, gambling of course. Still, at least he looked like he was winning. A few men in the common room shot her the kind of looks she did not appreciate, but there was nothing more. This was not that kind of inn, and anyway, from what she had heard, men in Falmy were being a lot more careful about strange women walking into inns these days. Matt did not notice her, continuing with his dicing until she pulled up a chair at his table and sat down next to him. When he saw her, he jumped so badly that he threw the dice out of the cup. His eyes were on hers, but she saw them tumble and land, a single pip standing up on each of them. "Elaine, what are you doing here?" He did not seem pleased to see her, and she felt a flash of irritation that quickly turned into guilt, especially as his gambling partners were already pushing back their chairs, making excuses to be elsewhere. "Can I not just want to see you?" she asked, even as she embraced Sedar and spun a weave against eavesdropping around the table. Matt flinched as the sound around them suddenly vanished. Blood and bloody ashes. You could warn a man before doing that. "Sorry, Matt," she smiled, not sounding at all sorry. "I would not come and bother you, but it is important. I need to ask you a favor." Matt huffed briefly, giving her that mulish look that she had come to associate with him, trying to find reasons to say no, before he suddenly smiled roguishly, leaned back in his chair, and crossed his arms. "All right, what is it that you want from me?" Let me guess, it's something to do with Taija, and there was the sarcasm she had been expecting. "Yes, it is Taija and Rand." She sighed at his smugly raised eyebrow. "They are going to go to Tyr to try for the stone. They are leaving tonight, and I will be going with them." That made Matt sit up and pay attention. "Are they mad? Are you mad? You're going to get yourself killed with a madwoman from the Age of Legends and a bloody man who can." He cut his own words off. "I suppose you want me to come with you." "Blood and bloody ashes, Elaine. You're asking a lot of a man. I don't want to go." This time Elaine interrupted him. "No, Matt, I do not want you to come with us." "No, I mean I would like you to." She blushed. Where was her self-control? "But that is the favor I need to ask of you. My mother will be worried about me. The White Tower has split. She will know I am not there. She will be worried and furious, and I do not want to fuel a breaking between Andor and Tar Valon. I would like you to go to Keemlin and deliver this letter to her." Elaine handed him a sealed envelope. Would you be able to do that, Matt, for me? She made her best pleading eyes at him, eyes that had obtained her illicit sweets many times through her childhood. Matt leaned back again, considering, apparently unaffected by her eyes. Burn me. You want me to go to Keemlin, not tear, just to deliver a message to your mother, the bloody Queen of Andor. Sometimes I forget you're a princess. He did not seem delighted by the thought. Elaine chose to ignore that comment. Yes, just to Keemlin. Deliver the letter and you will be free of Rand, Taija and Aes Sedai interference. She was not sure she liked the idea of that. She would be Aes Sedai one day after all, but Light, he moaned a lot about them. If you can be ready to leave today, Nynaeve and I can make you a gateway to just outside the city, so you will not have far to travel. After a moment more of consideration, Matt rose to his feet. Fine, I'll do it, but only because I like you, even if you are a bloody princess. He gave her that roguish grin again, and it was all she could do not to roll her eyes at him. Give me 1 hour, and I'll be at your rooms, ready to go. As he turned to go, she heard him mutter something about barely remembering last time he was in Keemlin anyway. How odd. It was a strange feeling stepping out of a gateway from the middle of the night into the first light of dawn. Particularly when Taija was going from a cool winter night through to almost tropical heat. It had been a relatively long journey, skimming through the space between worlds, and she was glad to be back into the real world. It wasn't long before the six of them saw the dark walls of Tyr looming above the run-down outer city. Dominating them all was the stone of Tyr, towering into the sky, a huge edifice that overshadowed the city. Frankly, it looked more like a mountain than a fortress. The One Power must have been involved in its construction. There was no way those people could build something like that without it. Taija felt a certain sense of relief that Rand chose not to pursue amassing an army. She was no general, but looking at that monstrosity, she was quite sure that no army from this era could take it. Perhaps with artillery, firearms, and channelers it would be possible, but she wouldn't have wanted to try. Tyr seemed like a miserable city once Taija was in it. Many of the streets were wet with deep mud, the people scurried around with downcast eyes, and it had a generally oppressive atmosphere. In the end, it didn't matter. She was there on a mission not to be a tourist. It wasn't long before the six of them had purchased rooms at a respectable-looking inn inside the city walls. Of course, none of them looked like they normally did. Instead of Taija's strange little group, anyone looking at them would see nothing more than a family of wealthy merchants looking for opportunities in the city. They established themselves over the next few days, going out, apparently to meet potential traders, but in reality getting the lie of the land. Rand and the girls were under strict instructions not to draw attention to themselves and just to find out what they could about Tyr. Taija took Alexei to have a closer look at the stone. Walking around the wide street at its base, she talked with Alexei about nothing that could arouse suspicion, while she gently probed at the stone with tiny inverted webs. It was difficult to do, especially while looking casual. For this kind of sensitive work, she'd much rather be able to sit somewhere out of sight and give it her full attention, but she still learnt a lot. The first thing that became clear was that she was right about its construction. The stone was built using the power, and it had certain protections built into its very foundations. Taija doubted she could make much of a dent bombarding it with the power using anything short of balefire. Perhaps if she could actually touch it, though, the other thing was that someone had warded it heavily, possibly with inverted webs of cedar, but based on the unfamiliar curves and intricacies of the wards that she'd tentatively felt out, Taija was fairly it was with Sedin. That meant traveling straight into the stone was therefore not an option. The wards also made it clear that one of the Forsaken had chosen to make Tyr their base. That complicated things. That night in the private dining room they'd taken over in the inn, Taija updated the rest of the group with her discoveries to horrified gasps from the girls and a look of despair in Rand's eyes. "So you're saying that we can't get into the stone?" he asked, slumping in his chair. "No, I'm not saying that. I'm saying that we can't take the easiest approach, which is just to travel straight in, grab Kalendor, and then either leave or fight off anyone who tries to stop us." She tried not to sound exasperated, but Taija felt like she'd had to repeat herself a few times already. "This just means we need to spend more time on preparation." Rand scowled, but didn't answer back. Unfortunately, Egwene chose that moment to mutter, perfectly audibly to the rest of them. Wool-headed men, always thinking with their chest hair. Rand's scowl deepened, and with a scraping noise, he pushed back his chair and stalked out of the room. Taija took a moment to get her temper under control. What had she been thinking, taking herself on a mission with a bunch of teenagers? Tell would have been able to smooth things over with a few words and a joke, but well. Alexei, please could you go and make sure Rand's okay? Of course, Taija. He nodded and headed out after the boy. Then she rounded on the girls. Right, all three of you. I've had enough. The last month seems to have been full of snipey comments about men, and frankly, I expected more of you. Rand is a bright boy who has just had a mountain dropped on his shoulders, not a sheep-headed fool, and the last thing he needs is comments from you. Alexei is just too nice to complain, but that doesn't make it acceptable to make them about him either. Especially you, Egwene, you grew up with him. But Taija, said I. Taija didn't let her speak. Yes, you get annoyed at men being stupid. I get it. I do too. I also get annoyed at women being stupid. Her expression left them under no illusion about which women she was annoyed about at that moment. From what I've been told, my entire civilization came to an end because men and women couldn't work together. It sounds insane to me. What I do know, though, is that all of the greatest achievements of my time were done by men and women working together. I suggest you remember that. If you can't, then at least restrain yourselves from saying anything unless it's helpful. At that, she turned on her heel and stalked out of the room after Rand and Alexei. Taija avoided spending too much time with the girls for a few days after that, and she was fairly sure Rand was venturing out for longer and longer each day to avoid talking to anyone too. Instead, she found herself spending most of her days walking around Tyr with Alexei. During those walks, she found a shop owner who was willing to let her and her retainer onto the roof of his building to sketch the stone after she told him that she'd always dreamed of seeing it and her father back home had asked for a drawing. Up there, while she was making diagrams of the stone, looking for weak points and possible places she could enter it, Alexei spoke up. Taija, I know you're stressed, but I think you need to be easier on Egwene and the others. His voice was gentle. They need to grow up, she groused. They seem to spend more time bickering with each other than actually doing anything productive. I'm just fed up with it. Of course they do, but they're only young, basically children. He paused. Well, except Nynaeve. Taija gave him an amused look. How old are you again? He ignored her comment, probably wisely. If you're not happy with how they're behaving, then maybe you need to give them something else to think about. It's no good just lecturing them about how things should be. You need to show them. Taija's first instinct was to deny it, but then she sighed. You're right, Alexei. It's just sometimes it's so hard. There are so many things to think about, and all I want to do is find a hut somewhere in the mountains and forget everything. I know, Taija, but you're strong, you'll manage. He put a comforting arm round her, and she leant into him, the view ahead of them dominated by the looming stone. That night at dinner, Taija told the other 5 of them that the next day they were all going to start training to attack the stone. She still needed to decide on how they were going to get in, but she could make sure that when they were in there they'd at least all able to work together. Hopefully, it could also start to close some of the distance that was growing up between the girls and Rand, and give everyone something to do other than brood and squabble. That actually seemed to perk them up, and not for the first time Taija was grateful she'd ever met Alexei. However, when everyone headed off to bed, Egwene stayed behind, looking nervous. Taija said, Can I ask you about something? Of course, what's wrong? She was clearly a bit upset. I've been having dreams. She spoke slowly, like she was having to pick her words carefully. Taija didn't interrupt. Not like normal dreams, but instead I keep seeing things that seem more real. Andya thought I might be a dreamer, but we could never work out whether I was or not. It would have been useful if she told her that some time ago, but Taija suppressed a groan and instead gently said, Go on, Egwene. I've been dreaming of a man waiting in the stone, watching Kalendor, but that's not what I want to talk about. Everyone seems to be having that dream. That was news to Taija, worrying news. What I wanted to ask about is, she took a breath, I've been dreaming that I'm inside the Stone of Tyr walking around it, and sometimes I see people. I've always hidden myself. I don't think they saw me until last night, but last night I was there, and I saw Fally and Boda in there, looking at Kalendor. Before I could hide, she turned round and saw me too. I know she did because she smiled straight at me. It took Taija a second to remember where she'd heard that name, and then it came to her. One of the black Adger that Siwyn said had fled the tower, with the dream Turangriel. Oh, for fuck's sake. The words come out before she could stop them, and she quickly moderated her tone. Thank you for telling me, Egwene. Sorry, I was just shocked. Taija looked the girl over. Well, you're almost certainly are a dreamer. It very much sounds to me like you've been accidentally entering the unseen world, and you saw Falion there. The bad news is that Falion is a member of the Black Adger, and she probably knows you're here now. We can only hope she only thinks it's you. There are 13 of them, so if they're all in tier, we may have a big problem on our hands. Egwene's face paled at that. The Black Adger. Here. Taija nodded. So we're going to have to be extra careful. We'll speak more of your dreams in a minute, but first, tell me about the man everyone is dreaming of. As Egwene started to perfectly describe, Beryl Taija's expression darkened. Had the idiot forgotten to shield his dreams? He must have been supremely confident in himself if that was the case. That or it was a trap. He wasn't someone she knew at all well, but she did remember that he had a reputation for elaborate schemes. Taija briefly considered entering the unseen world in person to attack his dreams, but then dismissed the idea as madness. She didn't have the skills or the knowledge to be confident she'd be successful, really didn't want to go into the unseen world anyway, and regardless there was he wouldn't be ready for something like that. Still, one plus to all of this was that she now knew who'd warded the stone. Equals. The next day it was time to start training the others. Before Taija could do much with them, though, she'd need to test them, find out what their capabilities really were. They couldn't train properly inside a potentially hostile city, so the 6 of them traveled out of Tyr to a tree-studded hill somewhere in the Andoran countryside. After a careful and thorough lecture on safety, Taija explained what the first exercise would be. Halfway up the hill, she spun a web of earth and shaped the ground into an oversized, high-backed armchair before climbing onto it, sitting cross-legged. So, I want to see how you can work together. I'm going to make you a gateway to a point where you're just out of my sight. You then have 5 minutes to work out a strategy between yourselves. Your objective is to touch me, either with the one power or physically. If you succeed, then you win. If I touch all of you with the power, or you take long enough that I get bored and have to come find you, then you lose. Is that clear? They all nodded, and Taija spun a gateway for them to step through before she settled back to wait. Their first attempt was sadly all too predictable. The 3 girls came marching through the trees together. At least they weren't silly enough to come out in the open, but they were barely making any effort to hide, and the feeling of them holding Sedai was enough to tell Taija roughly where they were. The men she didn't see at first, but she was sure they'd turn up. Taija let the girls get a bit closer and then spun 3 inverted webs, one for each of them, reaching out to touch them. As soon as the webs came into contact, each of them heard her voice whisper, "Dead." A few seconds later, Taija saw movement in the long grass to her right. It only took a moment for her to wrap Alexei and Rand in air and lift them out of the grass. She was about to release them when she felt the jolt of her flows snapping back into her, and the 2 men fell back to the ground with thumps. Taija smiled. It seemed Rand had taken the opportunity she gave him, although she wasn't sure where he'd learnt how to slice flows. She spun, and a web touched Alexei to whisper, "Dead," in his ear. However, the one aimed at Rand was cut again. He was staring at her with a look of slightly confused concentration, and Taija sliced through a couple of webs he sent in her direction. Then, without warning, several trees around her erupt into roaring flame, and his look of concentration was replaced by panic. Shit. Without hesitation, Taija spun a shield and slammed it between him and the power. She felt the resistance as she drove it in. He was already shockingly strong for someone so inexperienced with the power. It wouldn't be long before this wouldn't be an option for her even with her Angreal. A moment later, he heard her voice whisper, "Dead," in his ear. When the annoyed-looking group had gathered in front of Taija again, she looked them over. Well, that wasn't very impressive. None of you even got close. What do you think you did wrong? Nynaeve's expression was sour, but she was the first to speak up. You were able to find us before we could do anything, she thought for a second, because you could feel we were holding Sedai. Exactly. Well done, Nynaeve. Anything else? Elaine spoke up, We tried to come at you straight on. Even if we succeeded, it would just have ended up in a contest of strength. Very good, Elaine. It was refreshing how well they were engaging with the exercise. Rand and I shouldn't have split off from the women. We should have worked together more. This time it was Alexei. Taija could have hugged him. Of course he would know what to say. Yes, exactly. Rand can channel, of course, but I'm not sure it's reliable enough for you to want to assume it'll be available. His loss of control was actually quite worrying. So you're separating your channelers from the non-channelers and leaving both groups weakened and vulnerable. Now, let's do this again. I don't expect you to win, but if you can force me to move from my chair, we can buy cakes from the bakery near our inn to celebrate. Hopefully they do well enough. Those cakes really did look delicious. There was a definite improvement as they kept trying, but by the end the sweat-drenched group had had no success. It was a pity. Taija really did want a cake, but she had her integrity. Maybe she could sneak out with Alexei to get some while the others were busy. The key thing was that now they were working together. They even managed to get close when Egwene and Elaine distracted her with a flashy display, and Nynaeve opened an inverted gateway for Alexei right behind her chair. Taija was more than pleased with their progress, and now had some idea of the sort of things they needed to work on. Chapter 42. An Unexpected Guest. Chapter text Chapter XXX. An unexpected guest. After days of intense training, Taija could see that the group was starting to flag, despite their rapid improvement, so she gave them a day off. The kind of training they were doing was exhausting, and everyone needed rest sometimes. The girls were off exploring. Tyr and Nynaeve had said something about finding a wisdom, whatever that was. Alexei had also said he wanted to speak to a blacksmith, and so only Rand was with Taija in one of the inn's private dining rooms when a serving girl opened the door looking slightly glassy-eyed. "Mistress, you have a guest." Before Taija could reply, she stepped aside and Tel walked in, blue eyes coldly surveying the room. Taija was already moving, standing so fast that her chair was thrown over backwards, embracing Sedar to the point of pain. Rand was a bit slower to react, looking between her and Tel in confusion. Tel quickly held his hands out, palms out. "I'm just here to talk, Taija. I don't want to fight." She could blast him with everything she had, but she was in the middle of a city, something he'd surely considered. Their last fight told her that even with her Angreal she wouldn't have enough of an advantage in strength to quickly beat him, and she didn't want to be responsible for the deaths of hundreds or thousands of innocent Terns as they fought each other. Rand might be able to help if he could actually get his channeling under control, but at that point he wasn't skilled or mobile enough to be anything more than a liability. "What do you want, Tel?" Taija's voice was flat, emotionless. She couldn't let him know how much it hurt to see him like this, but underneath that the yawning hole that had been ripped through her was bubbling with anger. Rand took another second to work things out, and then went for his sword, the idiot. Tel no more than glanced at him, and he was frozen in place. Taija considered cutting him free, but Tel wasn't hurting him, and she didn't want to trigger the fight unless she had to. Tel's voice oozed contempt when he spoke to Rand. "I'm not here for you today, Luce Thurin. Count yourself lucky for that. Now sit in the corner and keep quiet like a good boy." "What do you want, Tel?" Taija repeated herself, pulling his attention back to her. "I've got nothing to say to you." Tel's eyes flicked back to Taija, looking her in a strange mixture of possessiveness and contempt. Her stomach clenched. They were so cold and hard, and that hideous scar sliced across his face. "I want to help you, Taija. I'm sorry I ran away last time, but I was shocked, surprised when I should have been delighted." His voice was smooth, as powerful as it ever was, the same voice that had wowed fans and impressed TV hosts, but oddly emotionless. He certainly didn't sound delighted. "I haven't been able to stop thinking about you since then, and I've been trying to find you. I'm worried about you, and I want to help you. How can you possibly help me?" "You joined the Forsaken. You can't help anyone, not even yourself." What more could she say than that? He shrugged, dismissing her words like they were nothing. "It was a different time. You don't understand how it was. You weren't there." "No, of course. It was so very difficult for you that you became a mass murderer and betrayed every principle we had." "Sure." Taija didn't even try to keep the biting sarcasm out of her voice, and it rose with anger as she went on. "Now what? You think you can come here and I'll fall over myself with delight at your presence. Give me a smile, and I'll flutter my eyelashes and leap back into your arms." He looked a little shocked at her vehemence and then collected himself with a slight smirk. "You always were passionate, Taija. It was one of the things I liked about you. But no, I don't expect you to do that. As I said, you don't understand how it was, but I want you to understand because then I can help you, give you the chance to survive." She glanced over at Rand. He was still okay. "You want me to understand? Go ahead, explain the inexplicable. I've experienced enough miracles since my alleged death." Her tone made it clear how happy she felt about those miracles. "What's one more?" Tell ignored Taja's sarcasm and started talking. Suddenly, he sounded almost earnest. She hated it. "Like I said, you don't understand, you weren't there. The light was falling apart, you know that, but it only got worse after you were gone. Luz Thurin was denying me at every turn, hoarding troops to sate his own desire for glory, but that I could perhaps forgive. What I could never forgive was the way his behavior got you killed. He ripped the only thing I truly cared about away from me with his glory hounding." Taija wanted to interrupt, to tell him how ridiculous he sounded, tell him that if he'd really cared about her, he'd never have joined the shadow. But he kept talking, and she kept listening in fascinated horror to this man who she'd asked to marry her only months ago, who changed so much that she barely recognized him. I kept on fighting, of course, giving everything for a dying cause. I kept on trying to fight for more unified command, for centralization and efficiency, and I was blocked at every turn. I led my armies, fought on the front lines, and watched my men die. Die pointlessly just like you died, while others bickered and put all of their effort into avoiding making any personal sacrifice at all. The coldness in his eyes and earnestness in his voice had been replaced with anger, spittle flecking his lips. Every day I fought, and every day I was rejected. Luz Thurin took resources, troops, and glory. Bureaucrats and politicians who'd never even seen a Sharklands hoarded whatever they could get their hands on. The system wasn't working, and so few people could see it. Every action I took to fix it was stymied. Luz Thurin was key to that. If he'd worked with me, then perhaps it could have been saved, but he wouldn't. He shot a hate-filled glance at Rand. "And all the way through this I have to work with, to obey orders from, the man who's responsible for your death. Of course he didn't kill you himself, but he as good as, all so that he could preen for the cameras one more time." That was too much. "You sound like Mirren when she talks about me. You're obsessing over a fantasy version of a man who's been dead for 3,000 years, and his imagined slights to you, just like she does with me. I was there. I knew Luz Thurin. Yes, he was a pompous arse, but he was on the same side as you, and he was a good man." Anger flashed into Tell's voice at her interruption. "My heart was ripped out the day you died, and it was Luz Thurin's fault. Him and Ishmael. You think I could keep going through that?" "I didn't think so, but I did. For 2 long years I did, watching everything just get worse and worse while I stood there alone, without you." He seemed surprised at his words for a second before he gathered himself. "That's when I started to think about how I could really make a difference. The light rejected me, took away the thing I most cared about in the world, and left me trying to save a fundamentally broken system. The light was going to lose, that much was clear, and the shadow would remake the world in its own image." He took a breath, returning to that strange, cold tone. The world was falling apart. Balefire ripping holes in the pattern itself, vortexes of black nothingness tearing through our world. That was when I first spoke to the shadow. Both sides were using it. Luz Thurin and a full circle of 72 obliterated an entire army of shadow spawn with balefire using the Infinity Chalice. The retaliation from the shadow burnt an entire city out of the pattern. He shook his head. You can't imagine what it was like then. It was worse than anything we'd seen in the earlier days of the war, the very pattern unraveling around us. I knew it needed to stop, or there'd be nothing at all left, light or shadow. So I made discreet contacts with some of the chosen, exerted my own political power with the light, and we came to an agreement. It was never written down or even openly acknowledged, but both sides stopped using balefire. That was when I realized the truth. The shadow promised a worse life than the light, that was undeniable, but you could work with it, shape it. Taija couldn't even muster a sarcastic comment to that. She was horrified by what he was telling her, but it wasn't the tell she knew. How could he be so stupidly, blindly, willfully ignorant, so horrible? By then it was clear that the light was doomed, and the choice was dying pointlessly or having the opportunity to make things better within the shadow. Better to have some survive and work to rebuild a better system under me than to watch everything be extinguished by Trolloc hordes. Oh, I kept fighting for a while longer, but I already knew deep down what I had to do. His eyes flashed, and he glanced again at Rand. It also offered me revenge. I could make Luz Thurin pay for what he did to you, but just as importantly I could get access to Ishmael, make him pay for that too. Even Lanfear for what she did. A sneer twisted his face, accentuating that horrible scar. Then I would become Niblis and be able to preserve something of humanity so that it could be rebuilt and become something better than our failed system. His rant came to an end, and he stood in front of her, painfully hard and emotionless. I can see you've had a great deal of success with those goals. Taija got her anger back under control enough to keep her voice dry. The light survived, so did Ishmael, and now you're stuck here in a medieval shithole. I suppose you did at least help Luz Thurin on his way, although I'm not sure the billions who died during the breaking would thank you for it. Did you dance with Trollocs in Adanza's ruins too? Or was that one of your friends amongst the chosen, and you just took the time to spit on my empty grave afterwards? Her words must have hit home because rage flashed across his face. I fought the shadow in Adanza after everyone else had fled. I left that city exhausted, surrounded by walls of dead shadow spawn, because I'd fought until I couldn't fight anymore, and fucking Luz Thurin decided it wasn't a strategic priority. Taija furiously resisted the way her eyes wanted to fill with water at the thought of her home left in shadow spawn-infested ruins. And that convinced you the right thing to do was to go and do that to someone else's city. What was the shadow's price? How many millions did you kill? How many other cities burnt? And for what? Nothing. Your own ridiculous delusions. He ignored her words. Taija, join me. The light is doomed. You've seen what this time's people are like, the jokes that they call Aes Sedai. Together, we can replace the lunatics that make up the rest of the chosen. Make sure that when the world is remade, it's remade in our image. Rule it together to preserve what we can. No more fighting, no more politics, just the two of us, together like we were always meant to be. He stretched out his hand to her. Come with me, Taija, be with me again. Taija met his eyes, looking into their cold, dead blue. After a moment she laughed. It was a dead, empty, hollow sound completely lacking in humor. She wasn't even tempted. Tell, you're pathetic. You come here saying you're giving me one last chance, and then use it to try to justify yourself, justify why you've done things you know can't be justified. What do you want from me? For me to say I understand and it was the right thing to do. She'd lost the struggle to keep her voice under control. Well, I don't, and it wasn't, and I never will. Taija, he sounded resigned, you do know what your future is if you don't come with me. Together we could save the world. Apart, if you're lucky, you'll be dead in months. If you're unlucky, you'll end up as one of Grendel or Raven's playthings. The boiling rage inside her flared ever brighter. Well, I'm glad to see you have such respect for the woman you want to rule at your side's capabilities. His voice softened. Come on, Taija. If you want to live, you need me. If you want anything of humanity to survive, you need to work with me. It's inevitable otherwise. You're not equipped to survive in this age. You're already making mistakes, Falme, me being able to find you here. Sooner or later you'll make one you can't fight your way out of. His eyes softened briefly, a tiny reminder of what she once had before the Creator cursed her to survive, then the cold hardness overwhelmed them again. Join me, and together we can make things better. Otherwise you'll be dead in 6 months if you're lucky. I don't rejoice in it. That's not a threat. In honor of what we had, I won't help them get to you, but I've known you for 15 years. I know you too well, every weakness you have, and you can't survive. Not here. Taija looked up into those familiar, yet alien eyes. You say you knew me that well after 15 years. Are you sure? Because I thought the same, and then I found I didn't know you at all. I arrived in this time with nothing but memories, and now you come to spit on those too. Taija, please, be reasonable. You understand. She cut him off, staring straight at him, her words those of a judge pronouncing sentence. T.L. Janin Alinsar is dead. I loved him, and I will remember him. You are Samel, and I have no interest in speaking to a man who could never be loved and will soon be forgotten. There was a moment of stunned silence. Samel didn't seem to know what to say, his face completely expressionless. Taija drew on Sedar and started to spin balefire, making the web slow and obvious. She wasn't sure she could actually make herself kill him, but when Samuel saw the flickering light start to form, his eyes widened, and he opened a gateway. She didn't really care where to. A moment later, he was gone. Immediately, Taija slumped, exhaustion hitting her. She wanted to cry, to rage, to destroy something, but inside she felt like a hollowed-out shell. Nothing at all except a yawning pit of emptiness. She looked dully at Rand and sliced the invisible web holding him. He'd be fine. Samuel hadn't hurt him. Not like he'd hurt her. TT, that was Tell. He wasn't really asking, but she nodded nevertheless. Yes, it was Samuel. She was already heading for the door. Right now she needed to be alone. She couldn't face talking to anyone. Everyone who could really understand had been dead for millennia, no doubt in part because of Samuel. Then Rand spoke again, his voice somehow different, more pompous, smoother. You should have never let him into your heart. The man was always going to betray you. From the very first time he set foot in the Hall of Servants, all he wanted was power and glory. It took Taija a second to fully process the words before she turned and looked at Rand through dull eyes. I thought you were a better man, Rand. Not just a reflection of Lews Therin, but a kinder man who might be able to unify where he pushed people apart. But sometimes you're just as thoughtlessly cruel as he could be. She had nothing else she wanted to hear or say from him right then. Taija channeled and stepped through a gateway straight to her room. Chapter 43. Interlude. A Decision. Chapter text interlude. A decision. Tell was angry. No, that wasn't true. He was more than angry. He was absolutely fucking livid. He turned on his heel and stalked back across his huge bedroom. That fucking bitch. He turned again. He'd been pacing all night, back and forth, his boots wearing a hole in the plush rug. How could she speak like that to him? He'd gone to her, risked himself to offer her a chance to live, and she'd spat in his face. He couldn't stop striding back and forth. Whenever he stopped, all he could see was her hard, empty eyes boring into his. He'd always loved the soft, deep, dark pools of her eyes, but there'd been no softness there. He'd bared his heart, exposed himself to her, and she'd thrown it back at him. He was Samuel. He justified himself to nobody. Those final words echoed through his head. Tell Janin Alinsar is dead. I have no interest in speaking to a man who could never be loved. She was wrong. He'd seen what needed to be done, and had acted when everyone else was too weak. It had been inevitable. He could remember a dancer at the end. He'd been standing on a small hill in the center of the People's Park, surrounded by the bodies of Trollocs and Myrddraal. Exhaustion nearly dragging him to his knees. His comrades either fled or dead. He'd already known the light had lost by then. He could remember Lews Therin telling him that he was letting Taija's death cloud his judgment. That Adanza wasn't a strategic priority, and that he'd wasted forces defending it that were needed on other fronts. He'd thought of refusals from the south to even send reinforcements, and wanted to burn the man out of existence, but he just stalked off then. Focus on strategic reality, said by a man who'd opposed his reforms at every turn. Don't let nostalgia cloud your judgment. Coming from a man who'd clung desperately to an outdated, failing system. The man who'd as good as killed Taija. He hadn't managed to kill Lews Therin back then, but he could still kill Lews Therin reborn. The light was doomed. She was tying herself to some foolish boy trying to claim the name of someone who, for all his faults, was more than some third-age peasant could ever become. Perhaps he should accelerate his plans. That would show her, show the world. He had contingency plans. He could kill Ishmael, any of the others that were capable of opposing him. In a week there'd be nobody left to oppose his rise to Niblis. Then maybe he'd be able to stop seeing her disappointed face. No, that was foolish. He had to admit she'd gotten to him if he was even considering this. He ran his hand across his head. He needed to pull himself together. They called Beryl the netweaver, but he had his own nets to weave, and he wasn't going to throw away years of work because that bitch had put him off balance. He'd been shocked by how vehement her rejection had been. He hadn't really expected her to understand. He'd been telling the truth when he said if you weren't there you couldn't understand. She was never going to. There was a niggling doubt bothering him, though, one that he couldn't quite squash. Years spent together, she had a temper on her, no question. When you pushed her far enough, all the softness vanished. But he'd never seen her so angry, so devastated. The utter disgust in her voice when she'd asked what he'd done to join the shadow. It took his mind back to places he didn't like to go. The screams of his command staff when he'd turned on them. The Trollocs stacking corpses for the cookpots at Sattel afterwards, armies of shadow spawn pillaging their way through cities as he stood above them. But she didn't understand. Everything worthwhile had its price. He needed to preserve something, anything, and she spat on the sacrifices that he'd made for the greater good. The idiot woman didn't even care that she'd be dead in the next 6 months. He knew her well enough. For all her faults, she was clever. She knew he was right. She was alone in the world, fighting desperately to save these barbarian peasants in a losing battle. The so-called Aes Sedai opposed her, because of course they did. She was left herding a bunch of children in some forlorn hope that they could win for the light, and she still threw his offer back in his face. If she'd been there, had survived that town hall and he'd died, she'd have done what he did. She'd have understood and made the journey to Sheol Gull. She just got lucky. No. He shook his head, his ever-moving strides still taking him back and forth across the room. He wasn't like some of the others, an idiot who'd tell himself comforting, arrogant lies. He knew his capabilities and those of his enemies. She'd have died spitting defiance, sooner or later, but she wouldn't have turned. Maybe that would have been better if he'd died and she'd lived. She'd have pushed on, fought on, it was ridiculous. Yes, she'd have done that, and then she'd have died with honor, alone and pointlessly. He had survived and he would lead. He would preserve humanity under his leadership. His boiling fury made him want to lash out, punish her, but he knew his limits. She clearly had an angriel and she was dangerous. She'd gotten under his skin. He needed to do something, though. He couldn't let her get to him like this. Fuck Ishmael and his plans. It was idiocy trying to turn the dragon. It just gave the boy more time to become stronger. That would do it. He would kill Luz Thurin, burn him to ashes, and then he would have had the first true step of his revenge. She'd no doubt have moved them since his visit, but that was fine. He had his ways. Unless she was a lot more on the ball than he expected, he'd have no trouble finding the boy. She was right about one thing, though. Tel Janin Alinsar was dead. Samuel didn't smile, because Samuel never smiled. He did stop pacing, though. Chapter 44. Thank the light for Alexei. Chapter text, chapter Roman 31. Thank the light for Alexei. When Taija woke up the next morning, all she could do for a while was stare at the wooden beamed ceiling. It felt too difficult to get out bed. She hadn't really felt okay since she worked out when she was, that she was 3,000 years away from anything and anyone she'd known. The crushing revelation of how Samuel had survived had ripped a hole through her psyche, and his pathetic attempt at self-justification only widened it. How could she have been so stupid? She couldn't even mourn what she'd lost now. He'd ruined that too. Everything was tainted. Every moment of love and joy. Taija knew that she needed to keep going, but it was so hard. What was even the point? She didn't want to be looked up to by the girls. She was still furious with Rand, even though really she knew he was just a kid. The Aes Sedai were a twisted perversion of her own beliefs. She was tired. She needed equals, friends she could ask for help, who'd look after her just as much as she did them. Alexei did his best. He really did. But the fact that she was relying on a 25-year-old farmer for emotional support to hold herself together illustrated the problem. It would just be so much easier to just go and become a hermit in the mountains, or go to the Blight and kill Shadow Spawn until she couldn't fight anymore. In the end, what got Taija out of bed was the realization that her thought processes were starting to sound like Samuel's explanations. She'd die before she started to travel down his road. So Taija hauled herself out of bed and achingly slowly got herself ready to go out. She'd thought she should keep training the others, but in the end she decided that she wasn't ready to face the girls or Rand. Not today. At least there was work she could set them to. Taija grabbed Alexei on her way out and told him that she needed to do some things outside Tyr and that he and the others should arrange a move to a new inn with new names. If she'd been thinking straight, she'd have moved last night as soon as Samuel left. But even if the best time to move was then, the second best time was now. She arranged to meet Alexei later so he could tell her where they'd moved to. Then Taija spun a gateway back to Falmy. Samuel found her and she wasn't sure how. The most obvious explanation, though, is that he found out from someone in Falmy. She wasn't likely to find any Darkfriend spies, but it was possible that he got the information more directly. Taija didn't much like Moiraine, but she felt she needed to make sure that the woman was all right. However, when Taija got to Falmy, Moiraine was nowhere to be found. In fact, the only people she recognized other than servants from the palace were some of the Sheenerans that accompanied Rand from Kerhian. They were very respectful to her, but all they could tell her was that Moiraine left the day after she and the Dragon Reborn did. If she had to guess, she'd probably either gone to Siuan or was looking for her in Tyr. Either way, a problem for another time. She'd check in on Siuan, but she and Moiraine had carefully not told her where the rebel Aes Sedai were based. Perhaps it was for the best. Back in Tyr, Taija met with Alexei, changed her appearance, and headed over to the new inn. Actually, one of the girls had done a very solid job of spinning him a new identity. If she hadn't known he'd be there, she'd never have recognized him. She'd have been proud if she had the mental energy for it. Alexei briefed Taija on her and the rest of the group's new identities on the way back to the inn. She took it in without saying much, just going through the motions. By the time Taija got to the inn, Alexei was visibly worried about her. He was never great at hiding his feelings, but then neither was she. Taija saw Rand, or at least someone who looked distinctly like his new disguise, in the common room when they entered the inn. As soon as he saw her with Alexei, he leapt to his feet. Lady Gissel, aye. Oh yes, that was her new name. At least he remembered that. Taija really couldn't face talking to Rand at that moment, though, so she just kept walking while Alexei made an apologetic face at him. When she'd been escorted to her room, Taija thanked Alexei, firmly shut the door and lay down on the bed, staring at the ceiling again. She knew she was being self-indulgent, that those kids needed leadership, but it was hard. She didn't want to be there. She didn't want to be in charge. Around an hour later, Taija heard a tentative knock on her door. She ignored it. She didn't want to talk to anyone right now. Unfortunately, whoever it was didn't seem to be going away. She heard another knock. A pause and then another, much less tentative. When she didn't answer again, the door handle rattled and the door swung open. Taija immediately embraced Sedai, but released it when she saw it was just Alexei. He stepped in past the threshold of the room, looking down at her. Taija, his voice was gentle. What's wrong? Didn't Rand tell you? She snapped. Unfairly defensive, but she couldn't help herself. No, he didn't. He's upset about something, but just told me it's none of my business. Alexei came over to her bed. Now what's wrong? You look halfway between wanting to kill someone and wanting someone to kill you. He gave a weak chuckle at his own joke. I don't want to talk about it, she said. There was a tearing feeling in her chest where her heart should be, a painful tightness, and suddenly she was twisting her mouth into a grimace as her eyes swam. She wouldn't cry, not over him, and not in front of Alexei. Taija forced a slow breath through a rib cage that didn't want to cooperate. Please just leave me alone. I'll be fine in the morning, Alexei. She knew he could hear the roughness in her voice, but forced a steady look at his face to convince him. Alexei sat down on the bed beside her. Taija, I've known you longer than anyone else here. You are not fine. He enveloped her hand in his, calluses scraping her softer skin. If you don't want to tell me then, don't tell me, but I'm your warder and you can trust me whatever happens. Taija sat silently and rigidly for a long moment, fighting herself and a rising swell of emotion that could drown her if she let it. A single tear broke past her control and ran down her face, and she gasped silently for one last breath to try to hold it in. In the end, she told him everything. Rand was not enjoying life. The last few months had been bad enough, but now things just seemed to be getting worse. He'd fought the Forsaken before, and every time it had been a terrifying experience he'd barely survived. He'd even spoken with Ishmael, although that was in dreams. What he hadn't been was utterly helpless at the hands of one of them. When Samuel had walked into the dining room, he'd barely acknowledged him, a child facing an adult man. A mere glance and he'd been blocked from the power and wrapped in air like a lamb for the butcher. If he was actually the Dragon Reborn, and he had his doubts about that, he'd need to fight these people, to beat them, and yet there he was failing at the first hurdle. He hadn't understood what Taija and Samuel were saying to each other. At times, it had felt like he almost could, but he didn't know how to speak the old tongue. He could see the hate-filled looks Samuel had shot at him, though, and Taija's own face had shown her emotions like an open book. She really wasn't like Moiraine or the other Aes Sedai he'd met. She didn't hide her emotions well at all, and what he'd seen made his heart break for her. Disgust and revulsion, absolute fury too, but dominating it all was just devastation and pain. He knew that, and yet he'd made that idiotic comment to her afterwards. He didn't know where it came from. He didn't even know anything about Samuel, but he'd said it nonetheless. It felt true. Somehow he knew that. but he couldn't get the dead look in her eyes when she'd looked at him out of his head. The sheer disappointment and hurt in her voice when she said she'd thought he was kinder than that. Sometimes he felt like she was the only person who really believed in him as a person. The one person who didn't care that he could channel. Those long conversations telling him that he was who he was, not just the Kinslayer reborn, that he could make his own destiny. That even if he was the dragon reborn, he could still be a better person than the dragon had been. Then there were her words, comparing him to the one person he desperately wanted to avoid becoming. Words coming from someone who'd known Luz Thurin personally. He knew he needed to be strong, so he hadn't fled, but the words had penetrated to his core. It had made it still worse when she just walked past him this evening in the inn's common room, not even acknowledging him. Nynaeve and Egwene certainly knew how to snub a man, but he'd never seen her do that to anyone before. How could he have been so stupid? Why couldn't he just keep his mouth shut? She must be absolutely furious, and he wasn't sure what he could do to fix it. So he sat morosely in the common room, sipping at a mug of ale and wondering if he should just climb the walls of the Stone of Tyr and try to reach Callandor that night. At least then he'd have an answer. Rand had just about decided that he'd finish his drink and then head for the stone when someone's hand descended onto his shoulder. He jumped, groping for his sword, before he realized it was just Aleski. He looked up at Taija's warder. The slightly older man normally looked relaxed and cheerful, but today he seemed to be doing his best imitation of Lan. "Walk with me." Rand could almost hear the sheepherder at the end of the sentence. It didn't matter that Alexei was nearly as odd a warder as Taija was an Aes Sedai. It seemed he could still be intimidating when he wanted to be. Rand hurriedly got out of the seat and followed the man out of the inn. He wasn't sure what Alexei wanted, but he was sure he'd never seen him looking so grimly serious before. They walked in silence for a while until Rand broke it. "Is Taija all right?" Alexei paused and then sighed, letting out a great huff of air, some of the tension leaving his body. "Yes, she'll be all right. She's sleeping now." He hesitated. "Why in the light did you say that to her, though?" Rand thought briefly about denying it and then gave a sigh of his own. "I don't know, it just came out, like I knew something about him, even though I'd never seen him before. It felt true, but I wasn't thinking." "Clearly," Alexei's voice was dry. "I wish I knew what he'd said to her, though. I don't think I've ever seen her so angry or so hurt." And then his voice dropped. "I know I hurt her more. Look, Rand, you need to understand what's going on." Alexei ran his hand over his face. Rand knew he was only in his mid-20s, but for a moment he looked much older. "Whatever you think, I believe you're the dragon reborn. More importantly, I like you and Taija likes you." Alexei hesitated, glancing up at the night sky, before seeming to come to a decision. "If she finds out I told you, she'll kill me. Well, probably not literally, she's too nice, but she'll be very angry. Still, I think you need to know, so that you can understand what she's going through and why it was so stupid of you to say that. Maybe the next time you'll keep your mouth shut." Rand couldn't say he liked being called stupid, but he could take it if he needed to, and he knew he needed to hear this. He nodded his assent. "I won't breathe a word of it to anyone." Alexei thought for a second, and then he began to speak. "You know she was betrothed to Samel. Well, to the man before he became Samel anyway." Without waiting for Rand to respond, he continued. "Whatever face she puts on for you or anyone else, she's deeply unhappy and lonely." He grimaced. "If you reveal I told you this, she won't need to kill you because I'll do it for her, but I'm fairly sure she cries herself to sleep many nights. She's not in a good place. Not at all. I think she's mostly keeping herself together out of a sense of duty to the light and desire you to protect you, Egwene and Elaine. And Nynaeve too, I suppose. Think about it, she was living in a paradise that we can only imagine with friends, family, a home. Now she's here with none of that, squabbling with Aes Sedai and with half the Forsaken desperate to kill her." Rand winced. He'd had no idea about any of this. She always seemed so strong, so comfortable in herself whenever she spoke to him. "Anyway," Aleski continued, not giving him the chance to say anything. "As you know, Samel came to speak to her. He was. Well, she's not quite sure, maybe halfway between trying to turn her to the shadow and trying to convince her he'd done nothing wrong. But it's Samel, one of the Forsaken. Why would she even listen to anything he said?" Rand protested. Alexei gave him a deeply unimpressed look. "Try to get some empathy into that thick skull of yours. She's alone here, with nothing except memories of the man she loved. who I'm fairly sure was a hero when she was in the Age of Legends. A look of distaste flashed across Alexi's face. She's already struggling, and then the man she loves turns up and has committed crimes you and I can't even imagine. Except, believe me, she can, because she's met the Forsaken, she's seen what they did. How would you feel if you went home and found your father had murdered and raped everyone you knew? With a sinking feeling in his stomach, Rand thought maybe he did understand why Taija had been so upset. So what did Samuel say to her? The next day, Taija was feeling more functional. She wasn't okay. She wasn't sure that she'd ever be okay again, but she could at least face speaking to people. Talking to Alexei helped, and not for the first time she thanked the Creator that he was the one that found her after the stasis box. At breakfast, she informed the others that they were all going to be heading out of Tyr to train again. She decided, especially with the Black Adger seemingly being aware of Egwene, that they needed to move against the stones soon, no more than a week from now. However, she wanted them to be as ready as they could be when they did make their move. Beryl would no doubt be expecting an attack, but hopefully he wouldn't be expecting all 6 of them working together. In no time at all, they were all back on the hill that they'd started the training on. This time, Taija told them they wouldn't be trying to beat her. Instead, she wanted to work on tactics involving gateways. So far, only Egwene and Nynaeve were strong enough to open useful gateways, but that didn't matter. To be fair, Rand also thought he'd done it before, but he wasn't sure how, and Elaine was getting close to strong enough. Today we're going to be practicing using gateways as a mobility tool. She started her lecture. Staying still in battle is making yourself a target. A slow fighter is a dead one. With gateways, you're not limited to your own legs. You can disappear and reappear anywhere on the battlefield, or even flee if you need to. Taija gestured across the field. So we're going to play a game of tag. They didn't seem to understand what tag was, so she took a moment to explain with a sigh. She quickly found out that they each had different names for the game. Anyway, Taija tried not to sound irritated by the diversion. Your objective is to survive. You're not allowed to attack me, but I'll be spinning webs that cover an area that will sting you if you stay in them for too long. You'll be able to see them as they form to let you dodge. The rules are, if you're stung, then you're dead. If you can dodge on foot or with gateways for long enough, then you win. Got it. At their nods, she clapped her hands together. Let's go. It turned out the painful stinging sensation that came from being caught in Taija's colorful webs was a good incentive, and they quickly improved. Not only did they get better at staying moving, but also at working together to travel back and forth. At first, the girls ignored the boys to keep themselves safe, but Taija quickly corrected that. Interestingly, it was also exhausting work for the girls. Rand and Alexei were very physically fit, probably from all the time they spent training with Lan, but the girls could definitely do with a bit more exercise. Taija wasn't sure how to discuss that with them, though. She couldn't really see them running in the inconvenient dresses that they favored. Even she'd had to be sneaking out by gateway at odd hours for runs in what everyone in that light-forsaken time considered to be men's clothing and hence deeply inappropriate. There wasn't much she could do about it now, but she was going to have to put some thought into it after the stone, assuming they survived. Over the rest of the week, Taija also took them through another 2 key uses of gateways in combat. The first was simply attack, using gateways to redirect your own attacks to hit an enemy from a different angle or bypass their defenses. For that, she split them into 2 teams, Egwene on one and Nynaeve on the other, and had them compete with each other. Second, she had them practicing using gateways to assault somewhere. Rather than dodging through them, they used gateways to bypass defenses and strong points and to support each other. Again, Taija had them competing in teams against each other, with her running interference to keep things interesting. It was all a very watered-down version of the tactics Lightbringer teams used to use. She'd never truly been one of them, but she'd worked with them often enough when they needed more of a heavy hitter and trained with them occasionally. Taija would never forget the terrifying efficiency with which those teams could fight their way through enemy channelers, and if she could get even a fraction of that into the heads of her companions, they'd be terrifying in modern times. If nothing else, their sheer combined strength in the power would make up for a lot of deficiencies, once they reached their full potential anyway. Taija also took the time one evening to talk Egwene through what she knew of the unseen world. Mostly she told her about the dangers to her, but she was at least able to explain the basics of how to manipulate the place. In particular, that it was all a question of willpower and visualization, and that everything was malleable. Taija made sure to tell her some of the horror stories that she'd heard in her time, and how the Forsaken and other predators stalked through that place. In particular, emphasizing how Egwene should avoid it at all possible. The girl looked suitably scared, but Taija still suspected that she was going to be ignoring much of her advice. It was the problem with teenagers. The whole group was getting better fast as they got towards the end of the week that Taija had given for preparation. They were all impressively talented youths and very willing to work hard. Back in her time, Taija would never have even considered assaulting a member of the Forsaken on their home territory with a team like this. But nowadays, she might actually have a chance. Working on training the others took up most of her time, and that was good. Not having much time to think meant she was holding herself together better than she had any right to expect. But sometimes Taija just couldn't make herself face the world, and she needed to be alone. She wasn't sure what triggered it, but one morning when she got out of bed, going out suddenly felt unmanageable. The empty hole torn out of her heart by being in that time by Samuel was just too big. Eventually, Alexei came to Taija's room to find her curled up on the bed, staring emptily at the wall. Taija, his voice trailed off. I'll be fine, please. She just wanted to be left alone for a while. Please just tell them I'm not feeling well. I'll look after myself. You all go and train. Nynaeve or Egwene can get you there fine without me. Alexei didn't want to go, but Taija insisted, and eventually he left to marshal the others. She was left alone with her thoughts. Tell allowed himself a nod of satisfaction. He wasn't sure what she was doing instead, but she'd left Lews Therin unattended. He didn't want to attack him inside the city. That would bring unwanted attention, but now the timing was perfect. He'd been watching, and she hadn't left her room. So when the web he'd placed on Lews Therin's sword the last time, he saw him, told him that he had traveled outside the city, he knew his opportunity had come. He did briefly consider whether it might be a trap, and then dismissed the idea. If she had any idea he was here, she'd already have acted. He'd give Lews Therin a little longer, just to make sure that Taija didn't show any signs of joining them, and then he would strike. Tell leant back in his chair and pretended to take another sip of ale. Everything was coming together nicely. Another 15 minutes passed, and it was time to leave. Straightening his finely cut coat, he headed out of the inn to find somewhere discreet for his gateway. Better not to be seen in general, but particularly when he was working in a city claimed by one of his colleagues. Beryl certainly didn't scare him, but it could be inconvenient. Turning into an alleyway, he spun an inverted web, opening a gateway to a hilly area somewhere to the northwest. Then he hesitated, caught in a rare moment of indecision. No, he would have his revenge on Lews Therin, and nothing would stand in the way of that. A moment, and he'd spun a web of illusion over himself. An outside observer would have seen him ripple until he seemed to be replaced by a much shorter, slim, brown-skinned woman. He ignored the moment of discomfort he felt at his choice. Really, he should be enjoying the dark irony of taking on this appearance. Given how much bigger he was than her, he didn't expect the illusion to hold up to close scrutiny, but it would let him get nearer to the unsuspecting third agers. Seconds later, he was striding through the grass towards them, Tyr left far behind. His steps were those of a grim executioner, a job to be done. Finally, he would get his revenge, and then he'd be able to continue with his plans, undistracted by the doubts that had been cropping up more and more over the last few days. As Tell got closer, he could see that they had stopped whatever they were doing, apparently taking a break. Lews Therin and that boy that followed Taija around were lazing on the grass, while the girls were standing over them. They looked tired and sweaty, but seemed to be happily talking to each other, laughing at some joke, which was something of a surprise. He thought that Lews Therin was surlier than that in his current incarnation. Still, no matter. It would be a pity to kill them while they were unsuspecting, but victory came before honor. As he got closer, they looked up and saw him, so he waved and kept walking forward, preparing several inverted webs for when he felt he was close enough to ensure a quick victory. It was easy enough to spin a web to change his voice too, especially when he was so familiar with hers. "Hello," he called out, making his voice enthusiastic. The boys got up and Luz Thurin waved back at him, taking a step forward before the other one stopped him with a hand across his body. "Taija Sedai," he shouted back. "It's good to see you on your feet. Has your stomach improved?" Internally, Tell scowled. The boy might well be on to him. He was fairly sure this was a trap of some kind, but there was still a chance, and either way he'd get closer if he could keep them talking. "Yes, must have been something I ate. I'm feeling much better now, so I thought I'd come to supervise your training." There it was. Just a glance from the boy and fire was erupting around Tell. It was impressive coordination. Sedar, of course. He doubted Luz Thurin had learnt how to invert his webs. It was actually admirable how well they worked together. If only the forces of the shadow could do the same. Contemptuously, he sliced the webs assailing him and let loose with his own inverted webs. They would die. 5 children, one of whom couldn't even channel, were no match for him. Fire sprang forth from him, shrieking through the air to engulf the 5 of them. At the same time, lightning bolts struck down, dragged by him from a clear sky. Irritatingly, they all shattered against a barrier, and finally Luz Thurin seized Sedin. Far too slow. He really was just a boy still. Killing him would hardly be a challenge. A pity, but Tell knew victory was more important than glory. He wanted his revenge. Idly, he spun more webs, bringing together the elements to send huge balls of fire mixed with whirling, razor-sharp blades of air, this time focusing them all straight towards Luz Thurin. A gateway snapped open beside Luz Thurin, and he dived through, escaping Tell's attack. He hadn't felt Sedin in that, so it must be the girls. He was already starting to get irritated by them. Without thinking, he fended off a web of Sedin that Luz Thurin had sent his way. Powerful for someone as inexperienced as he was, but crudely spun. With an irritated grunt, Tell began to bombard the girls with lightning and fire, while absently slicing anything that came from Luz Thurin. Even together, they wouldn't be able to stand up to him, and he could take his time. His bombardment came to a sudden end when his instincts screamed, and he threw himself to the ground, just dodging the end of a staff as it whistled through the space his head had been occupying a moment ago. What the fuck just happened? He scrambled back, frantically fending off the sudden flurry of webs thrown at him, while also trying to get away from the swiping staff. Of course, the boy had come through another gateway behind him. Impressive for untrained peasants. Taija had clearly been busy. He rolled sideways to dodge the whirling and jabbing end of the staff. No time to get distracted by thoughts of the time they'd spent training together. There, the boy came too close, and he hooked a foot behind his ankle. A quick grab, push with the other foot, and he was down, Sam'el jumping to his feet over him, fending off webs of Sedar and Sedin as he moved. Air to seize the boy. He needed to change position before the others battered down his defenses. It was quickly becoming clear that much as he could dominate any of them one-on-one, he couldn't quickly win a contest of brute strength against the 4 of them. He spun a gateway and leapt through it, bringing the boy with him. He'd make him pay for nearly killing one of the chosen, but he deserved an honorable death, not just to be obliterated by a channeler. Tell glanced towards the girls and sent a series of webs of fire and earth their way. He'd get back to them. Drawing his sword, he turned towards the boy, lining it up, level with his exposed neck. Above him, lightning detonated futilely against his wall of air. The boy's eyes widened. Fear painted across his face as he realized what was about to happen. Tell swung only for his sword to slam into solid air with a clang. Another web of air sprang up between them, too close and unexpected for him to stop it, picking him up and throwing him away from the boy in a tumbling heap. Ever-present anger surged in him. He treated them with honor, and this is what he got in return. Fine, he would show them why he was known as the Destroyer of Hope. He channeled, forcing Sedin into a series of complex webs. Fire erupted around the girls as the earth exploded under them. Lightning struck down towards the boy. Only Luz Thurin was already there, poorly spun, but powerful, a web of air shattering his lightning bolts with deafening roars. Why? He didn't sound much like Luz Thurin. Why are you doing this? Haven't you done enough? You walk around trying to justify your crimes, while every day you add to them. Fire burst from Luz Thurin's hands. A stone was ripped from the ground and spun through the space Tell would have been in if he hadn't stepped through a gateway. You speak of crimes, Luz Thurin. What about your crimes? Tell sliced a web from one of the girls and casually flung her backwards with his counterstroke. Opposing me, for glory, letting the light wither, refusing to do what needed to be done. Luz Thurin staggered backwards under the onslaught of Sedin that Samuel threw at him. You want to talk about crimes? You killed everyone you love, and everyone that I loved too. You light-blasted hypocrite, everyone you loved. I look into Taija's eyes every day and see what you did to her. Tell dived to the side as fire streaked at him out of a gateway from an unexpected angle. How can you talk about love when you treated her like that? She lost everything, and then you came in and somehow managed to make it worse. Fury twisted Luz Thurin's face until staggered backwards, barely deflecting the flurry of fire, air and earth bombarding him. You don't understand. How can you? You're just a farmer, some boy from this light-forsaken age. He channeled, and Luz Thurin was thrown off his feet, barely rolling out of the way of a blade of air that would have cut him in half. You ask me what I did to her. I did what needed to be done. If she can't see that, then that's her fault. It's nothing but her own weakness showing through. She never deserved me. His voice rose to a scream, his killing stroke sliding off a barrier of cedar. Luz Thurin climbed to his feet again. If you truly believe that, then she's right. Tell Janin is dead. Suddenly attacks were coming at Tell from 3 different angles. The girls had clearly repositioned themselves while he was focused on Luz Thurin. You had your friends, your allies, your whole world, and yet you still turn to the shadow. Taija has nothing. She cries herself to sleep and then gets up to help us like nothing ever went wrong because unlike you, she's strong. All she had was memories, and now you're turning even those to ashes. Someone like you could never truly understand love, loyalty, friendship. That's why the shadow will lose. The shadow's victory is inevitable. Tell traveled out from between the girls and flung a blossom of fire at them, only to see them step through gateways of their own. I gave everything I had for the light, and it wasn't enough. He staggered as a web of air clipped him. His own fire came close to incinerating Luz Thurin and the boy before it was sliced. You stand there judging me when you can never understand. With your friends, allies working together. He deflected a gigantic fireball into the sky. How could you understand? His voice trailed off. Tell didn't know how it was happening, but combined they were holding him off. He'd taken their measure, they weren't that good, yet he was struggling. Suddenly he just felt tired. This had been a mistake, 4 of them, maybe even 5, together maybe another time. Too much strength, too much talent, even if undeveloped. Luz Thurin shouted to one of the girls and more gateways opened. Fury surged in him. He wasn't going to lose to a gang of barely trained children. With a snarl, he started to spin balefire. He wasn't going to end his journey at hands of half-drained children. Yet he didn't finish the web. For a long second he held it, and then finally he let it dissipate with a grunt of frustration. His first contact with the shadow, the start of his fall, no ascension, had been with the aim of stopping the use of balefire. What was he even thinking? What was the point of this? With a roar of frustration he channeled, and a gateway opened behind him. A second later he was back in Ilion. There would be better opportunities. Luz Thurin would be alone sooner or later. Equals. At the end of the day, Taija was feeling a little more functional. She'd managed to make her way down to the inn's common room for a light dinner, and she thought she could just about face seeing the others. However, when Alexei and Rand came in, they were grim-faced. They quickly spotted her and hurried over to her table. Taija. Rand jumped at his own indiscretion and looked around to see if anyone heard before dropping his voice to a whisper. Nynaeve, Egwene, and Elaine, they've been taken. What do you mean they've been taken? In a flash, Taija went from dull apathy to fully awake, sitting up straight and adrenaline shooting through her. Aes Sedai. The Black Adger it must have been. Alexei jumped in. There were lots of them, at least 10, and they surrounded the girls out of nowhere. We were walking a bit behind them, and I don't think they realized we were together. Rand interjected. I thought the girls were going to channel, blow them away, but then they just stood there. They looked so scared. I was going to try to help them, but Alexei stopped me and said we needed to get help first. He said there were too many. He sounded half apologetic, half accusatory. Taija stood, mind whirling. Alexei was right. You did the right thing. You couldn't have taken on that many eyes, said I. Light everything was falling apart, but at the same time she felt more alive than she had all week. At least here she had a purpose. Did you see where they took them? Yes, Alexei nodded. We followed at a safe distance. They were taken straight to the stone. Fuck. So they were almost certainly working with Beryl. Taija remembered Siyuan's list of black Aes Sedai, 13 dark friend channelers. She tried to suppress her shudder. All right, fine. We need to move. Fast. She stopped and took a closer look at them. Why do you smell burnt? Have you been ignoring what I said about safety? Rand and Alexei looked at each other, but Rand spoke first. Tell he. Alexei followed right behind, speaking over him. Samuel, he attacked us. We fought him off. There was something more going on there. Taija knew him well enough. There was something bothering him. A lot. Samuel attacked you. She felt a spike of pain in her heart and ruthlessly suppressed it. She didn't have time for that. Are you hurt? What about the girls? No, we fought him off. Rand answered, looking proud. We worked together just like you taught us, all of us together, and we were beating him. Taija gave him a flat look. The 5 of you beat Samuel. Rand's nod was enthusiastic. Alexei's was slower, more thoughtful. Taija shook her head. No, I don't think so. I'm sorry, Rand, but the 5 of you can't beat me yet, and memories of long training sessions together flashed through her head. And Samuel is at least as good as me. He's stronger in the power, and he's a skilled soldier. He must have had some sort of scheme. They clearly wanted to argue, but kept their mouths shut. Then Rand glanced nervously at Alexei, who winced. There's something else, too, he said slowly. Taija was too busy trying to think through the consequences of everything and work out how Samuel found them, and absently asked, What's that? I can channel. Oh, Taija looked up and actually focused on him. She nearly said, Congratulations, but just caught herself. His face told her everything she needed to know about how he felt. Oh, Alexei, I'm so sorry. When she thought about it, even without this taint and the bigotry, it was deeply worrying. Without a teacher, his odds were poor, and she didn't think Rand was anywhere near being able to realistically teach someone how to channel. That was a problem for tomorrow, though. I'm so sorry, Alexei, she repeated and reached out to give his arm a squeeze. We'll talk more and work out what we're going to do, but that can wait. It has to wait. For now, we need to move on the stone. The girls need us, and we need to get Rand in there before Samuel tries again. Alexei steeled himself and nodded, although she could still see the worry in his eyes. You're right. What do we need to do? They were both looking to her for leadership that she wasn't sure she could provide. She needed to try, though, to live up to their expectations, not to live down to Samuel's example. All right, here's what. Taija stopped when the two of them suddenly lost focus. A moment later, she turned to see what they were staring at behind her. Moiraine, gliding into the common room like she owned it, Lan stalking behind her looking as dangerous as ever, and finally Perrin trailing awkwardly after them. How the fuck is everyone fucking finding me? For fuck's sake. Taija wanted to scream the words, but kept her voice low. It was getting ridiculous. Right, you two, upstairs. Now. We'll continue this in my room. She caught Moiraine's eye and gestured with a jerk of her chin before following after the boys. In her room, Taija waited for the arrival of Moiraine and her party. When they came in, she stood and gave her a shallow bow. Moiraine said, I didn't expect to see you here. Taija said, She gave her a tiny nod of acknowledgement. I go where the light needs me, and that is currently at the Dragon Reborn's side. She shot a glance at Rand. Great, if she wasn't going to bring up Taija's disappearance with Rand and the girls, then neither was Taija. She was sure she'd be hearing about it at length later. Well, it's good to see you, Moiraine, said I. Taija was only half lying. Her strength and the power wasn't insignificant, and she had no doubt Lan was deadly with his blade. We have several problems, and we were just discussing what action to take. Taija quickly updated her on the day's events. Given this, we need to act immediately. I plan to enter the stone tonight with Rand and Alexei. We will rescue the girls and then take Kalendor if Rand can, so we can settle this whole Dragon Reborn thing once and for all. Of course, your help would be invaluable if you're willing. Moiraine gazed at her with infuriating serenity. Well, it seems you have placed yourself and your charges in a difficult position. The worst thing was Taija couldn't even argue. She wanted to protest that Moiraine didn't understand, but she couldn't bring herself to use the same words as Samuel. When Taija kept quiet, Moiraine gave a small, satisfied nod. Of course, I will assist you. We work towards the same goals. Perhaps this time you will listen to my advice, though. What is your plan? Taija quickly descended into the nitty-gritty of planning with Moiraine and the others. Much as she disliked the woman, she had to admit she knew what she was talking about and actually gave useful advice. The biggest surprise, though, was her revelation that Kalendor was a male sangreal. With that, Rand would be unbeatable, as would any of the Forsaken if they could get their hands on it. Taija thought she was starting to see at least the outline of the net that Beryl was weaving. Chapter 45. Interlude Roman 12. Are we the bad guys? Chapter text Interlude Roman 12. Are we the bad guys? Tell finished changing out of his ruined clothes into clean ones of equally fine cut and make. He was sore and aching in various places, and if he hadn't run a cleansing web over himself, he'd smell faintly of smoke. However, his body's aches and pains were nothing compared to the anger burning inside him. Beaten off by a bunch of children. What was wrong with him? He was the destroyer of hope. He needed to get his head back in the game. He had plans that needed to be pushed forward, things to do. If he kept letting himself be distracted, he'd be easy meat for the rest of the Chosen. They could sense weakness, and they wouldn't hesitate to turn on him, any more than he wouldn't hesitate to turn on them. Well, most of them anyway. He began the web for a gateway, altering it slightly to send the polite chime that warned anyone at the other end that he was coming. After a suitable pause, the gateway opened, and he stepped through. In an instant, he was in an expansive atrium, sunlight shining down onto marble columns and gushing fountains, while stunningly attractive, completely naked men and women cavorted around him. With long practice, he ignored them, focusing his attention on the full-figured woman in front of him. Again, he ignored the way her dress clung to her curves, showing more than it concealed, instead looking straight into her eyes. "Greendel," he nodded to her. She smiled widely. "Samuel, how lovely to see you. To what do I owe the pleasure? A drink?" She gestured, and a naked girl who couldn't have been far out of her teens immediately hurried over to offer him a glass of wine. He glanced at the girl before dismissing her from his mind. "No, thank you." "Oh, Samuel, you should relax more," Greendel laughed. He shot a glance to her left, and a handsome young man scrambled to get on his hands and knees, while another knelt beside him holding a cup of wine up as if he was praying to her. They certainly both thought of her as a goddess. Greendel settled down onto a human chair and gave Samuel a smile that would make lesser men go weak at the knees. "Since you don't want to take the time for small talk, tell me, what is it you want, Samuel?" Samuel ignored the slaves. They weren't important. "I have a proposal." Greendel leant forward, interested, and not at all coincidentally exposed, yet more of her expansive cleavage to him. Typical. "I have plans that will elevate us in the great Lord's regard and secure our positions as first among the Chosen." "Go on." Greendel was polite as ever, her voice smooth, encouraging. "I want to kill Luz Thurin. Ishmael is losing his grip, wasting time trying to turn him. We both know the great Lord's interests will be better served by having him dead. For that I need your help." He hated having to admit that he couldn't do something alone. Greendel raised a perfectly manicured eyebrow, shifting on her living chair to get more comfortable before clasping her hands in her lap and looking straight into his eyes. "Are you sure you're not letting your judgment be clouded by your hate for the man?" "No." Samuel scowled and moderated his tone. "You know perfectly well how I feel about Luz Thurin. You also know I'm nothing like Demandred. I don't let my emotions rule me." "No, of course not." Greendel reached out and took her glass from the hands of her slave before sipping from it. "So what does this have to do with me?" Samuel knew she was trying to needle him. She always liked to provoke people to say more than they meant to. Luz Thurin has found himself allies. Allies who will be significant opponents of the great Lord themselves one day. He met Greendel's eyes, intensity burning in his voice. "They cannot be allowed to survive, and neither can he. But alone I'm outmatched by weight of numbers." He didn't try to hide the grimace at that admission. "However, together we could overwhelm them with ease, removing what are potentially the greatest opponents of the Shadow at a single stroke, or possibly compelling them to our side. We would reduce the other Chosen to insignificance in the face of our victory." Greendel glanced at one of her performing slaves, and the girl hurried over to prostrate herself in front of her before starting to massage her ankles and calves while staring adoringly up at her. "I can see the appeal of what you propose, but there are significant risks. Have you considered?" Greendel was cut off by the entrance of a finely dressed man with gray streaked through the brown of his thick beard and hair. A beautiful, young, pale-skinned brunette trailing behind him, clutching nervously at the sides of her elegantly tailored silk dress. Greendel looked over to them, a flash of annoyance passing across her face before she smiled and clapped her hands together in apparent delight. Samuel took a step to the side as the man hustled up to Grendel. He had eyes only for her, and he suspected that the man would have just walked through him if he hadn't moved. Normally he'd have considered burning the man to ashes for the insult, but today the ever-present anger didn't flare. It just seemed unnecessary, trivial perhaps. Reaching the nude slave massaging Grendel's legs, the man immediately knelt, his knees hitting the floor with a thump. "My lady, I have come as you requested, and I have brought my daughter and heir. As I told you, her beauty is spoken of widely." He didn't seem to see the slaves cavorting around the room. His eyes were completely fixated on Grendel. His daughter, however, did. She was staring wide-eyed at her surroundings, confusion warring with awkward disgust and fear. Tell shifted uncomfortably. He'd seen this play out before. Grendel had her predilections. He knew that well enough. "Father, what's going on? What are we doing here?" She was refusing to give in to her fear, a brave one then, but he could hear the tremor in her voice. Grendel rose from her human chair. "You have done well, Lord Parnin." She eyed the girl, her gaze roving up and down, eyes coldly analytical before she smiled beatifically. "Yes, you did not exaggerate at all. Your daughter is a beauty. She will do well." "Thank you, my lady." Lord Parnin sounded, delighted to have pleased her, ecstatic even. "What are you talking about, father? What is wrong with you?" The girl looked like she was about to try to run, not that that would do her much good. Tell could see the rising panic in her body language. She tried to shake her father's shoulder, and he roughly brushed her off without taking his eyes off Grendel. "What have you done to my father?" Grendel just smiled lazily, looking down at her, a predatory gleam in her eyes. Despite being no taller than the girl, she somehow seemed to loom over her. "Oh, I would not worry about him, my dear girl. He has served me well, just as you will." The way she looked around the room at her slaves said everything. Tell could see that she was relishing this. Was she putting on a display just for his benefit? Surely not. She knew he was made of sterner stuff than that. Wastefully distasteful as he found it, this was nothing he hadn't seen before. The girl was backing away from Grendel, retreating from her father too, her eyes frantically looking for anything that might help until they settled on Tell. The only other person in the room wearing clothes, the only one who wasn't gazing adoringly at Grendel. "Sir, please, help me." "I don't know what she's done to my father. I think she must be an Aes Sedai. Please." Tell could see the desperate hope in her face as she begged, but she must know that he wasn't going to do anything to save her. The goosebumps on his skin hadn't gone away since he arrived, but Tell could still identify the exact moment Grendel placed her web on the girl. The sharpness in her deep brown eyes suddenly faded. Her gaze on him became unfocused as terror, hope, alertness, even life dimmed in them. He grimaced. Grendel's methods were crude, wasteful. The girl looked away from him, towards Grendel now, tension leaving her body. Tell tried very hard not to think of Taija's companions, a similar age to this girl. So full of passion, working together to fight him, just as it should be. Loyal, competent servants of the light. The way they were so relaxed when he arrived, able to share hopes and dreams before he descended on them. He absolutely did not think about how another pair of dark brown eyes would look as life faded from them to be replaced by perverse worship. He was Samuel, greatest of the chosen, not some weakling who couldn't make the choices that needed to be made. The girl stumbled to her knees in front of Grendel, mumbling words of adoration, her eyes shining with nothing but empty devotion for the woman in front of her, while her father looked benevolently on, a vacant smile on his face. Grendel seemed to have forgotten Tell was there, smiling happily down at her newest slave. "Wonderful, simply wonderful. You will start off serving me food and drink, and I shall then consider how best to employ you. Now strip, take that dress to be disposed of, and go to the kitchens." Long-forgotten sensations were welling up inside Tell as the girl hurried to disrobe, previous awkwardness and fear entirely forgotten. Was this really what he had sworn himself to? He'd seen it or things like it happen so many times before, though. Sacrifices needed to be made for victory, he knew that. Yet some things were. He did what he had to do, and that was that. Her business done, Grendel turned her attention back to Tell. "I do apologize for the distraction, but you know how it is. There is always business to be done." She seemed to have forgotten the bearded father kneeling in front of her, not that he objected in his delight at being so close to her. "Now back to your suggestion." The honest answer is, it seems like a risk. Now, I am not saying no. We have worked together ever so well since the first time I brought you to Sheol Gull. She gave him an almost fond smile. I know that you do not jump precipitously into action, and I am inclined to put my trust in that, but like you I am cautious. I will need time to consider it further. These half-drained children can wait a week. I shall have my answer for you then. Did he even want this? Was she like this even back then? For some reason, the idea of unleashing this woman on anything felt far less appealing than it had when he first arrived. Was revenge really so important that he could subject someone to her simply for having had the bravery and ability to fight him? Thank you, Grendel. I'll return for your answer in a week. Tell gave her a shallow bow, forcing the words out. Grendel clapped her hands together. Well, now that that is settled, are you sure I cannot persuade you to join me for a drink? Conversation here is always a little dull. She laughed and glanced across the exposed flesh of her devoted slaves. You do know how I like to reminisce about the good old days, and there are so few of us left. Tell shook his head immediately. I have too much that I need to get on with, but thank you for your kind hospitality. The polite words were ashes in his mouth. 1 week. He channeled and stepped through a gateway back to Elian without another word. As soon as Samuel was gone, the smile vanished from Grendel's face. There was something going on with the man. He was absolutely not himself. If she did not know any better, she would think he was in the early stages of a breakdown. Of course, he projected his usual cold certainty, hard eyes, and aggressive body language. Standard for the man. So much tension, and so many useful buttons and levers to press if you knew what to look for. She could remember all those years ago, the culmination of months of careful work when he had finally agreed to turn to the shadow. In hindsight, it had been almost laughably easy. A broken man standing on the precipice, just waiting for someone who could understand what he was thinking and feeling, and then give him a small nudge. Really, they had been kindred spirits, both dedicated in their own ways before being failed by those around them, allowing them to forge their own paths to greatness. The chosen were always on guard around her for compulsion, checking their servants for her webs and protecting themselves. Yet they always seemed to forget that she had earned her third name for her understanding of the human psyche, and if you knew how to repair something then, you also knew how to break it. They really were all fools, seeing the obvious, crude tools and neglecting to look for the subtle and invisible. The power was not everything. As for Samuel, well, it was obvious what was bothering him. That girl he had been involved with. The great lord only knew how she had survived. That was certainly an unpleasant shock. She was not even sure what had attracted Samuel to her. Perhaps he just liked mild women that would just do as he told them. She supposed it would fit with him. He did so hate anyone questioning him. Regardless, one day Taija would make a fascinating addition to Grendel's collection. Admittedly, she did not meet Grendel's normal aesthetic standards, but that did not mean Grendel would not make an exception for someone like her. The last true Aes Sedai, perhaps as a footrest, it would be delightful. She allowed herself a little shiver of pleasure. Samuel, though, well, he was clearly going to be off his game for at least a little while. Grendel briefly considered taking advantage of that, removing him from the competition while he was distracted, but then dismissed the idea. Would be easy, a few words in Ishmael's ear, a stealthy strike in the night. But she had no doubt that he would pull himself together soon enough. If there was one thread that ran deeply through Samuel's psyche, it was his sense of certainty, and that would not be swayed, not after he had gone so far. He'd continue to come up with justifications for everything he had done because he'd never be able to accept anything else. Anyway, she was actually fond of the man. Well, as fond as she could be of any of the chosen. He really was one of her greatest works, the culmination of years of subtle conversions of flawed men and women of the light. When she became Niblis, there would be a place for him too. Under her, obviously. Perhaps she should help him get back to normal sooner. It would be simple enough to remove Taija and return matters to the status quo. But no, that also carried with it significant risks, not least that he might try to take revenge on whoever he blamed for it. She had put some thought into whether she could frame another of the chosen, but for now the idea would go on the back burner. Better to let him think he was the one dictating events. As for Samuel's proposal that they disobey Ishmael and work together to eliminate Luz Thurin and his companions, well, if he was thinking normally, he would never have suggested it. Whatever she said, she had no intention of doing anything to help him with that. She would do as she always did. watch and wait from the sidelines, as she maneuvered the rest of them around the board like the unwitting fools that they were. Chapter 46. I have a very particular set of skills. Chapter text chapter Roman 32. I have a very particular set of skills. After some discussion with Moiraine and the others, they all agreed on a plan. The first step would be sneaking in and freeing the girls. Then they'd move on Calendar. Stealth would be key to success. Taija knew it wouldn't last forever, but the longer they could keep the defenders, and more importantly Beryl and the Black Adger, ignorant of their presence, the better. They all took a couple of hours of rest to prepare themselves, and then made their way to the stone. Moiraine's presence was actually a blessing from the Creator. Taija had thought disabling and replacing some of the defenders of the stone would be the best approach. Moiraine convinced her otherwise. Instead, they rode on a fine carriage that she somehow obtained. Rand, Alexei, Lan, and Perrin were under inverted webs of illusion, making them look like house guards. Moiraine was playing the role of a Tern High Lady. Moiraine had assured Taija that the real High Lady would not be around to contradict their story, and so she'd also altered the appearance of the carriage to match the house colors Moiraine told her it needed. Moiraine's plan was definitely better than hers, but still, the woman hadn't needed to make a snippy comment about not everything needing to involve hitting someone over the head. With Moiraine's help, their entrance into the stone was anticlimactic. The defenders at the outer gate made a perfunctory check of the carriage, urged on by the High Lady Melassa's impatience, and they were through. Taija supposed a noblewoman and a few guards were hardly going to be a threat to a fortress like that. In no time at all, they were disembarking from the carriage and passing off the horses to a simpering stable boy. Moiraine contemptuously ignored him, her nose high in the air as she swept into the stone, trailed by the rest of them. Somehow she seemed to know where to go, heading unerringly towards what must have been the stone's dungeons. Taija noticed that there seemed to be a lot of defenders of the stone running around, mostly heading upwards, but more importantly, completely uninterested in bothering a High Lady and her guards. Matt breathed a sigh of relief as another group of defenders ran past him without stopping. This day was turning out even worse than he'd expected, and he'd known it was going to be a bloody terrible one ever since he'd seen Elaine, Egwene, and Nynaeve being dragged into a waiting carriage. Those flaming dice had been rattling in his head the whole time since he'd overheard Lord Gibral's conversation in Keemlin, only to come to a crashing stop when he finally found the girls, only minutes too late it seemed. They'd been in disguise, of course, but he was no fool, unlike them. What in the light possessed Nynaeve and Egwene to take on the appearance of members of the women's circle he didn't know. Still, at least it allowed him to recognize them, and Elaine had had enough sense not to go around looking like Queen Bloody Morgase. As soon as the defenders had passed, he continued making his way down towards the cells, scurrying round corners or behind columns when it looked like he might spot it. He'd already had to fight a number of defenders when he blew his way into the stone, and hadn't that been a surprise? Who'd have thought that fireworks could do so much damage? He just meant to distract the defenders. Well, it had certainly done that. Then again, the ale he'd encountered up there were probably doing an even better job of it. It wasn't long before Matt reached the cells, which seemed suspiciously empty of both guards and prisoners. He quickly started making his way past them, searching for the girls. He needed to find them and then be out of there before the bloody Aes Sedai caught up with them. Aes Sedai were bad enough when they weren't actively looking for you. Eventually, he turned a corner and froze when he saw a woman sitting outside a cell, looking like she was mostly asleep. After a moment, he started moving again, but much more slowly and quietly. He expected to be seen at any moment as he snuck up on the woman, but he had no choice. Light, he wished he'd just turned around and gone home. It was what any sensible man would do. He recognized her from when the girls had been captured, another bloody Aes Sedai. Yet she stayed dozing, never even looking up as he approached her. In for a penny, in for a crown, when he was in reach, he swung his staff, clipping her across the side of her head. Thunk made him wince. He didn't know why she'd taken the girls prisoner. He could certainly think of a few reasons someone might want to, and do worse too, but hopefully she'd have no more than a headache when she woke. Not that he planned to be in the same city as her when that happened. Bending down, he rummaged in the Aes Sedai's belt pouch, and pulled out a likely-looking key to insert into the cell door. Luckily, it turned easily, and the door swung open with a long creak which ended with his gasp at what he saw. Inside, Egwene was lying asleep on a bed, while Nynaeve and Elaine faced the door. That wasn't what shocked him, though. All three of them looked like they'd been in a common room brawl and came off the worse for it. Their dresses were torn and purple bruises marred their faces and arms. What had those Aes Sedai done to them? Nynaeve and Elaine seemed just as stunned to see him, and there was a long pause. Then Elaine leapt into his arms, giving him a tight hug. Matt. At the same time, Nynaeve spoke, sounding shocked. Matrim Cawthon, what under the light are you doing here? I came to bloody rescue you, he said. Burn him, he wasn't sure why he'd bothered. Of course she'd be like this. She was always like this. Nynaeve hurriedly nodded, flushing slightly. And I thank you for it, Matt. Why wasn't she telling him off? Had she been beaten too hard? There's no time for talking, we need to be moving. I'll wake Egwene. Matt looked Elaine over. She really didn't look good. What happened to you? Was it that I said I thought they weren't allowed to hurt people? Perhaps he should have hit her harder. It is fine, Matt, I've had worse. He bloody well doubted that. She turned her nose up the way she always did when she was irritated by something. We were captured by the Black Adger. Do you think they treated us like valued guests? The Black Adger. Matt winced. Burn him. What was he doing there? I suppose they wouldn't at that. He laughed nervously. Blood and bloody ashes, the Black Adger. A quick shake of his head. Are you all right? They didn't hurt you too much. Elaine shook her head, her lovely tresses bouncing with the motion, briefly hiding the bruises on her face. No, I will be fine once we are out of the stone anyway. She put her hand on his arm and smiled prettily at him. Thank you, Matt. However, I thought you were in Keemlin. Not that I am ungrateful, but why are you here? He groaned internally. This wasn't going to be an easy conversation. Being a princess, and all Elaine could get very worked up about certain things, and this was something that could get anyone into a snit. Could we perhaps leave it until we're out of the stone? We're going to be knee-deep in flaming defenders soon, or worse. Yes, Matt's quite right, Nynaeve interjected, again not commenting on his swearing, perhaps that Aes Sedai had hit her one too many times. We need to get going before we're caught again, or that mad woman decides to do something insane like blow up the whole stone to free us. Which mad woman would that be? Matt span at the sudden, terrifyingly familiar, feminine voice behind him to see a short, bearded man in the uniform of one of the defenders of the stone. He gargled for a second at the incongruous sight before it clicked. It was that bloody mad woman. Well, he wasn't going to give her the satisfaction of seeing how much he wanted to be anywhere else. Taija said, it is nice that you have finally arrived. You will see that I have already rescued the ladies. He gave her a bow with a flourish. There, not even Nynaeve could accuse him of being rude. Ah, Matt, what a pleasant surprise. It seems we were barely needed at all. The voice was distinctly odd coming from a man's face. Why were the girls all staring at him instead of her? Girls, you look terrible. Nynaeve healed the other two. Moiraine said, would you mind healing Nynaeve? Moiraine was here too. Of course she bloody was. Matt edged away as he saw Nynaeve lay her hands on Egwene and Elaine, their bruises vanishing quickly. It was bad enough that Elaine was becoming an Aes Sedai, but at least she could have a laugh. Now he was faced with Moiraine, who was the epitome of Aes Sedness, and Taija, who, well, he wasn't quite sure what she was, but frankly, she terrified him, whatever Elaine said about her. A richly dressed noblewoman swept into the room, Taija standing aside for her. That would be Moiraine then. A second later, Nynaeve also looked healthy again. Moiraine moved towards him and he leapt back. He wasn't having any of that. He'd bloody well be fine, thank you very much. Right, now that that's done, can you fight? Taija's voice cut through his thoughts, and he found himself nodding with the girls. Her voice seemed different to usual, harder, more sure of herself. Excellent, then we move out. We're going for the heart of the stone. We avoid fighting for as long as possible, but once we're discovered, we move as fast as we can. Anyone gets in our way, don't hesitate. Knock them out if you can, kill them if you have to. The four of you are now servants. Follow behind us and keep your eyes down. Matt winced. He'd already fought his way in here to rescue the girls, and now she wanted him to join them. Not bloody likely. Yet when they started moving, he found himself following. Outside, the cell Taija suddenly stopped and turned to the unconscious Aes Sedai lying on the stone floor. Black Adger. Her voice was cold. Yes, Berylinaran. Egwene answered, looking angrily down at the unconscious woman. A moment later, Matt heard all three girls gasp, and a glance at Moiraine told him even she looked perturbed. It must be some kind of Aes Sedai thing. The woman was still breathing, and he couldn't see that anything had happened. Taija had been surprised to find Matt had already freed the girls when she arrived. He clearly had even more hidden depths than she'd thought. She'd have to really try to pin him down for a proper chat at some point. She did still owe him an apology, too. For now, though, they all needed to keep moving. It seemed like something else was going on in the stone. Taija was sure that their stealthy entrance had been helped by whatever was drawing the defenders of the stone up towards the upper reaches of the stone. It couldn't last forever, but the further they could get undetected, the better. They all made their way through the surprisingly wide corridors of the stone. Many defenders and servants went by, some giving them odd looks, but it seemed their disguises, as guards plus Moiraine's haughty false identity, were enough in the current chaos for them to get by. That came to a crashing end when they entered a large chamber, arches lining alcoves in its sides. As soon as Taija walked in, she felt Sedar being channeled from around the room. Then glowing women step out from the shadows all around them, 12 of them. Moiraine failed to suppress a wince, her voice tight. I am shielded. Shields also slammed into place on Nynaeve, Egwene, and Elaine. Rand looked like he was about to do something precipitous, and Taija grabbed his arm before his did. She assessed them with a glance. 2 circles of 6, enough to shield any of them if given the chance, well except her with her angriel. The Aes Sedai weren't even looking at her. They had no idea she could even channel. To them, she was just another guard, at worst an irritation. Idiots. Nevertheless, they weren't completely stupid. Taija felt the air around her harden into place. One of the Aes Sedai, Taija thought it was Falion, stepped forward. So it seems our trap has caught somebody, although I do wonder where the dragon is hiding himself. She glanced over Taija and the immobilized men. When she was met with defiant silence, she stalked closer. Perhaps a little pain might loosen your tongues. Yes. Taija's willingness to let her monologue ended at the mention of torture. She was already embracing Sedar right up to her limits through her angriel. It only took a thought to unleash it. Fire, spirit, and water split 3 ways and inverted. 3 of the Aes Sedai, including Falion, exploded into torches of flame, their brief shrieks cut off almost instantly. The moment of distraction was all Taija need. Razor-sharp webs of spirit and fire lashed out all around her. Air softened to nothing and shields withered away, and she was already moving. A gateway sprang open in front of Taija mid-step, and by the time her foot hit the floor, she was through it. 2 of the black Aes Sedai were in front of her, turning too slowly to face her. She grabbed them with overpowered webs of air and slammed them into the ceiling hard enough that it probably broke every bone in their bodies. An Aes Sedai across the room recovered from her shock long enough to pull her hand back, making a throwing gesture. Taija saw the web of fire forming and cut it with barely a thought. At the same time, her own web of earth and fire ripped the flagstone under the Aes Sedai's feet upwards into a storm of razor-sharp shards of rock. Various webs flashed back and forth across the chamber. It seemed the girls and Moiraine had joined in. A bit slow, she'd have to get the girls to work on that. A pair of blacks were frantically fending off Moiraine and the girls' webs. It was barely a challenge to spin her own, sweeping one of them's feet from under her, sending her briefly airborne. Someone, Taija thought it was Moiraine, hit her with a fireball before she hit the ground. Only 5 left. Taija could take them single-handed, even in this confined space. Webs flashed back and forth, and she was almost tempted to see how the girls handled it. But no, this was a fight to the death. Imagine if one of them got hurt, because she was just trying to make it a teaching moment. Taija spun earth and fire and discs of rock, span out of the walls at blinding speed, passing straight through a pair of Aes Sedai, leaving their bisected corpses to collapse. Then she had to duck, almost instantly spinning a barrier of air around herself as something seemed to shake the whole chamber, maybe the whole stone. Rubble fell from the ceiling, huge lumps of rock that could crush a man, and a couple of archways simply crumbled into dust. She didn't feel any webs, was it Beryl? Taija was spinning a nasty surprise for him when she saw Rand looking mortified. Ah, he lost control. She ignored the sound of Matt swearing. She wasn't sure what was wrong with milk in a cup, but it wasn't important. When the dust cleared, the remaining 3 black sisters seemed to have vanished, presumably fleeing for their lives. Something really needed to be done to help Rand, but Taija didn't know what. She told him everything she could about channeling Sedin, beyond that he needed a teacher before he accidentally killed himself or someone else. By the time everyone had pulled themselves together, there wasn't much point in pursuing the Black Adger. Taija suspected that, like most Dark Friends when faced with overwhelming force, they'd keep running, but if they didn't, then so be it. Now what they all needed to do was move as fast as possible. There was no way that Beryl was unaware of their presence by then, even with all the chaos going on. Rand had just channeled a large amount of Sedin, and even if he hadn't, the whole fortress probably shook. Everyone all right? Good. Taija raised her voice. Beryl will certainly know we're here now, so no more hiding. Now we move fast for the heart of the stone. If anyone tries to slow us down, we remove them. She quickly reached out with the power and unraveled the webs of illusion disguising them all. We can't afford mistaken identity now. Strike fast and strike hard. If you can avoid killing guards, fine, but don't put yourself at risk. Now let's go. Don't slow down. Following her own instructions, Taija broke into a fast jog, the kind of loping pace that, after years of practice, she could keep up almost indefinitely. Alexei and the boys quickly matched her pace. The girls and Moirin seemed to be struggling more, so she slowed herself down slightly. They really shouldn't have been wearing those stupid, heavy dresses. Jogging through the huge fortress, the corridors seemed oddly empty. A finely dressed man demanded that they stopped and was rewarded with a clip around the head from Alexei's staff. A couple of times, groups of defenders ran through cross corridors ahead of them without even looking. The first opposition they met was a squad of 20 defenders of the stone forming a block across the corridor, a wall of spears pointing at them. Taija spun faster than anyone else. Fire, air, and spirit in a ball flung down the corridor at the defenders. Then an opaque wall of air, earth and spirit blocking sight and sound, only briefly coming together to hide the blinding flash of light and deafening crash of the explosion for her side. The defenders were already disoriented, and she traveled, stepping through a gateway behind them even as Lan, Perrin, Rand, Alexei, and Matt crashed into them. Taija was spinning webs of air, tied to fade after a couple of hours, pinning them to walls. The others rampaged through them, cracking skulls with staffs, hafts, or hilts. By the time the girls reached them, they were all incapacitated. Hopefully they'd live. A couple more times Taija saw groups of defenders fighting figures wearing grey-brown coats and breeches. It almost looked like camouflage, which wasn't something she'd seen in this time. Regardless, they didn't interfere with her progress, so she didn't do anything to them. It wasn't long before Taija saw the great doors that she thought must be the entrance to the heart of the stone, the place where Kalendor apparently awaited Rand. She reached out with tendrils of spirit as she jogged towards them. Surely there were traps there. Things had been oddly easy so far. Yes, there was something. Taija stopped and held out a hand to halt the others. This is almost certainly a trap. Just give me a second. I need to focus. Chapter 47. The Dragon Reborn. Chapter text chapter Roman 33. The Dragon Reborn. Taija's tiny flows of spirit extended along the great doors, gently probing and exploring. It was soon clear that there were a number of wards spun into them. She wasn't sure what they all did, but she was also sure she didn't want to find out. If her suspicions were correct, Beryl wanted Rand to go into that room, but not to have anyone else to support him. So presumably something that would incapacitate anyone that wasn't Rand, or possibly something aimed at female channelers. She could think of a few ways she might do it, and Beryl probably had more ideas than she did. Unfortunately for Beryl, Taija didn't intend to go along with his plan. Eyes half closed, she spun spirit into various minuscule nooks and crannies in the wards. She wasn't going to be at all subtle about this. There was no time, but then he already knew they were there. Well, maybe not her personally, but Rand and at least a few others. Hooks of spirit inserted Taija pulled deeply on Sedai, as much as she could take through the angriel, and channeled it down her webs of spirit. Then, for lack of a better word, she flexed the webs. What had been delicate flows were now iron-hard bands of power, and after a brief moment of resistance, whatever wards Beryl placed over the doors shattered. Taija didn't see his webs, of course, but fire engulfed the door and the whole stone shook around her. Before the dust had settled, she was waving the others forward through the now gaping doorway, Rand in the lead. She, on the other hand, hung back slightly. The heart of the stone was a huge circular chamber, a multitude of columns towering up to a vaulted ceiling. It was undoubtedly impressive. However, everyone's eyes were drawn to what was floating in the center of the chamber, a crystal sword hanging suspended in webs of cedar and sedin. Calendor. If Moiraine was right, and it was a sangreal, then it would make Rand unstoppable. He hesitated at the sight of it, standing unmoving until after a second Egwene gave him a little push. He started towards it, tentative at first, but then visibly gathering himself. The others followed a little behind him. Entranced by the sword as they were, they didn't notice Taija sidling off behind the columns rather than following. Her suspicions were confirmed when Beryl stepped out from behind a column on the other side of the room. She immediately knew something was wrong. A faint smirk was visible behind his short, neat, silver beard. He was confident, far too confident for a man faced with what he must have known was at least 5 hostile channelers. Rand stopped dead. "Who are you?" he asked. There was a slight tremor in his voice. Taija thought he already knew the answer. She was slowly making her way round the outside of the chamber. The man's smirk grew. "I am Beryl. Do you not remember me, Luz Thurin? The good old days when we sported together, those times when we turned swords from a bloodless bit of fun into a way of warfare. Don't you remember meeting me on the battlefield?" If Taija remembered correctly from what she'd heard about him in the past, he liked the sound of his own voice a bit too much. She was relying on that to some degree. Rand shrugged. "Not really, should I?" Taija allowed herself a small smile at the snarky nonchalance he managed to put into his voice. It certainly wiped the amused smirk off Beryl's face. "So be it." He glanced at the others. "I see that you still let your heart rule you and stop to rescue your women. Still, I will make time for them afterwards. Do not worry. I will make sure they are properly looked after, in memory of you." His eyes promised a horrible ending for them. "However, we both know what you are really here for." He gestured grandly at Calendar. "Take it. Strike me down. Otherwise I will kill you and your friends." Taija saw the girls and Moiraine starting to spin webs, ready to strike as soon as they got a sign from Rand. Then the light of cedar winked out from around them in quick succession. Fuck. Her mind came to a grinding halt for a moment. He must have had an angriel. Taija didn't know exactly how strong Beryl was, but he wasn't among the strongest of the surviving Forsaken, and there was no way he could have shielded all 4 women just like that while they held the power. If he had a strong one. Lan took a stride forward, and then stopped abruptly as the air solidified around him and the others. Taija suspected Beryl had tied off the webs. Even with an angriel, holding 4 women, all those webs of air and fighting Rand all at the same time would be a strain. She was still moving slowly, quietly. She didn't think he'd seen her. If he had, there'd be fire in the air. "Go on, Luz Thurin. Take it. Perhaps it will be enough to allow you to survive, to allow you to save your friends. I will give you this chance in memory of the friendship we once had." Beryl's confident smirk was back. His cold eyes told Taija what he really thought of that friendship. She was going to have to spend some time teaching the girls how to undo tied-off shields if they survived this. Beryl didn't seem to be inclined to kill Rand. There was no sign of a battle with the power going on. They might have been channeling spirit at each other. She couldn't tell, but Beryl would surely overwhelm Rand if they were. "I had thought that you might have Taija Kosola with you. I heard she survived." Beryl looked pleased. This might have been more of a challenge if she had been here. "As it is, if you will not defend yourself, I will kill you." He didn't hesitate after those words, drawing his sword and throwing himself at Rand in one smooth movement. Rand drew his sword almost as fast, but he was immediately on the back foot, fending off lightning-fast slashes from Beryl's weapon. However, he quickly recovered. Their swords flashing together, meeting again and again, the loud clangs of their impacts ringing out. They were impressively fast. Taija once saw Durham Laddle compete with him, and it had been an exciting match even for someone like her who wasn't all that interested in sword fighting. One thing was quickly clear, though. Rand was severely outmatched. Taija thought he was pretty good, but he was clearly not a master on the level of Beryl. They moved around the chamber as they fought, Rand constantly giving ground to stay alive. Beryl moving with smooth confidence, never in danger himself, his sword flicking in and out, barely deflected by Rand. It was quickly clear to Taija that Beryl was deliberately letting Rand retreat, but making sure that his steps were taking him in a closing spiral towards Calendar. Presumably, He intended to strike the killing blow a moment after Rand touched the sangreal. By then Taija had maneuvered herself round far enough that she was confident that she wouldn't hit any of the others in the crossfire. She briefly considered just hitting Beryl with balefire while he was completely unaware. It would be a fittingly simple end for someone who took such pride in his complex schemes. However, after a moment's thought, she dismissed the idea. He had a male angreal, and Taija wanted that angreal for Rand. Or she supposed if Rand had a sangreal, then she wanted the angreal for Alexei. Either way, she wanted it, and she was prepared to take a risk to get it. Balefire would mean destroying it along with Beryl. So Taija paused for a second, spinning an array of webs that taxed her even with her angreal. A moment's wait for the right angle, and there. Taija completed her webs, hurling Sedar away from her. 4 webs of razor-sharp spirit and fire sliced the webs, shielding Moiraine and the girls. They could look after themselves now. At the same time, she opened a pair of gateways, sending webs of air through them to hit Beryl from behind, and flung fire straight at his face. Taija didn't wait to see whether she got him or not. She was already opening a gateway to the far side of the chamber and flinging herself through, out of the way of any retaliation. He survived. Without thinking, Taija spun a complex web of fire and air, tens of explosive darts forming themselves above her, and then flying towards Beryl. Explosions ripped along the floor as they bombarded him, sending red-hot shards of rock flying where they weren't sliced or blocked by him. She spun a hammer blow of air from above and swept another web along the ground at foot level, not to pull his feet from under him. This one was a blade. Both were sliced, but Taija could see he was reeling, staggering backwards, putting everything he had into fending off her flurry of webs. The stone of the floor reached up to envelop his leg before bursting into dust. Wire thin strands of air enveloped him and vanished. She sent fire at him from above, whirling blades of razor-sharp air from the side. He was going to crack any second, miss something, and then he'd be done. Then suddenly, Beryl gasped, and Taija frantically pulled back on her webs, bringing her attacks to a sudden halt as a sword appeared through his chest. For a second he groped at it, trying to say something. Then he slumped to his knees to reveal Rand standing behind him, the life leaving Beryl's eyes even as he fell. It took Taija a second to realize what had happened. That was incredibly stupid of Rand. If she'd attacked Beryl from behind through a gateway, she might have hit Rand without even realizing. Still, she couldn't argue with the result. She'd be able to factor some of this into his training later. For the moment it was time to celebrate. Taija smiled widely and went towards him. "Well done, Rand, it looks like." Her words were cut off by sudden pain. It hurt. She was flying through the air, and she didn't know how she'd get there, and she was screaming. Taija hit the ground, curled into a ball around herself, trying to stop the pain. As suddenly as it came, the pain vanished, leaving her lying on the ground, still twitching. She didn't think she'd broken anything, but she wasn't totally sure she could stand up right then. She did manage to prop herself up on her elbow to see a bearded man, his normally kindly face twisted with rage, step out of a cloud of darkness. Ishmael. Taija felt Sedar being channeled, and webs of fire and air flashed across the chamber towards him. Moiraine and the girls. He didn't even look at them. Webs vanished, cut or blocked. Taija didn't know. Black lightning shot out from him, and they collapsed with their own agonized cries. But he only had eyes for Rand. "I offered you the chance to serve the great lord twice, lose Thurin, and you spurned me. Well, this time I will kill you, and you can serve the lord of the grave in death instead." "Rand!" Taija shrieked. "Callandor." He hesitated for the briefest moment, and then dived for the floating sword just as Ishmael spun that black lightning. Taija heard Rand scream with pain for the moment it took for his hand to close on the crystal sword. Then there was only blinding light. Equals. As soon as his hand touched Callandor, the agony vanished, and Sedin surged through Rand, torrents of it beyond anything he had ever imagined. He teetered on the brink, fighting the deluge with everything he had, clinging on with his fingertips, barely resisting being swept away. It felt like it took agonizingly slow minutes, even if it was probably less than a second, but eventually he brought it under control. Standing on the precipice of a waterfall, feeling the raging flow of Sedin hurtle through him, but he had balance for now. The taint washed over him too, oozing waves of it flooding his senses with filth. Slowly he turned towards Ishmael. This time I'll kill you once and for all. It felt like more than words, a pronouncement of the way the world would be. With this much power, he knew it would be true. The Forsaken hesitated and then channeled, seeming to tear a hole in space and diving through it. It was like Taija's gateways, but different. He was going to end this. A thought and flows of Sedin shot out from him, mirroring Ishmael's web. When he stepped through the gateway, he found himself right where he started, in the heart of the stone. Except there was no one else there, everything was strange, and a bar of liquid fire streaked through the dim light straight for him. A thought, and he brought Kalendor between them, Sedin hurtling through it, through him. The bar split in two and obliterated columns behind him, bringing them tumbling down. He heard a curse and copied Ishmael's web, sending a thick bar of blinding light back at him, carving through columns, bringing yet more destruction to the heart of the stone. Ishmael fled and Rand followed. Traps were thrown in his way. Webs he didn't understand. Trollocs, barriers, monsters he'd never seen before. Each he obliterated with Kalendor in ways he couldn't fully comprehend until eventually they found themselves back in the heart of the stone. He was a butterfly tossed around in a hurricane of Sedin, but with this much of the power, he could do anything. Rand focused the flows and threw them at Ishmael in a wall of white-hot fire that obliterated everything it passed over. Yet somehow the man survived, staggering backwards, clothes smoking, and one of his arms hanging at an odd angle. For the first time, Rand saw true fear in his eyes. He raised Kalendor, spinning a huge web, something momentous, something he knew would permanently end the man. The web came together, an intricate pattern of doom, but before he could bring it together, Ishmael spun another gateway, fleeing through it. This time Rand felt nothing from Ishmael's channeling. He couldn't follow. After a moment he channeled, instinctively replicating the gateway he'd made earlier, and stepped back into the stone. There seemed to be a lot more people now, defenders of the stone and the strangely clad people who'd been fighting them. They weren't fighting now, but rather standing uneasily eyeing each other under the eyes of a glaring Taija, Moiraine, and Nynaeve. As soon as he stepped out of his gateway, every eye in the room snapped to him and the glowing sword in his hands. For a moment there was silence, and then Moiraine's voice rang out. All hail Randall Thor, the dragon reborn. Chapter 48. Interlude Roman 13, Realizations. Chapter text Interlude Roman 13, Realizations. Samuel thought back to his conversation with Grendel. She'd be expecting him soon. He knew he was due to go back to her to get her answer to his proposal, and yet, as that deadline got closer, he found himself less and less eager for it. Had he just been deluding himself about what he wanted to do? Every time he thought of Grendel, all he could see was the spark of life draining out of terrified brown eyes, pleading with him for help. How could he even justify that? Sacrifices needed to be made to preserve what he could. Fuck. When he was Niblis, that wouldn't be happening, but he wasn't Niblis, and were some sacrifices worth it? For years he'd have said yes, but he couldn't deny that he wasn't sure now. How could anyone work with a monster like Grendel? What had he even been thinking? When he'd made his way to Shale Gull with her, she'd seemed like such a kindred spirit. Two people failed by the world, ready to bend it into the shape that it should be. She'd understood him, sympathized, felt the same things. He'd seen her indulge her pleasures before. What was wrong with him? Was revenge on Lews Therin, on Ishmael or Lanfear worth this? Was preserving what he could of the world in the face of the failings of the light worth it? Inevitably, as it had so many times since his first visit to Tyr, his mind went back to Taija. He didn't need to concentrate to see her disgusted, devastated face. Pathetic, Samuel muttered to himself, not sure whether he was agreeing with her or condemning her. He'd been thinking, though. He wouldn't be who he was if he hadn't been. Using Grendel to help him destroy Lews Therin's allies wasn't going to work. Tell suspected she was just stringing him along anyway, but in his current state, he couldn't seriously consider fighting by her side. Even Lews Therin didn't deserve a fate like the one that Grendel would inflict on him. No one did. Still, Samuel knew how to work around his own failings. Taija had thrown him off. He was having an emotional moment. That was to be expected. It would pass. He had few weaknesses, but knowing them allowed him to minimize them. Grendel was disgusting. She always had been, and he lowered himself by working with her. Going to her had been a foolish idea, pathetically seeking comfort from someone who would never be capable of giving it. Fuck. Pathetic. Fortunately, he had a plan that would make Grendel and the rest of the Chosen unnecessary, irrelevant even. It all made much more sense. Why was he even scrabbling around with filth like her, when he could have his revenge and ascend to lead the forces of the shadow at the same time? That was why he was walking through the dimly lit corridors of the Stone of Tyr, wearing the drab clothes of a servant and carrying a pitcher of wine. Lews Therin had revealed himself to the world by taking Kalendor. He had also made himself a target for any of the Chosen that wished to take the sangreal from him. Taija had removed the tracking weave from the boy. Of course she'd worked that out. However, it was easy enough to find Lews Therin now that he had claimed the mantle of dragon once again. The boy would be on his guard, no doubt, but no man could be awake at all hours. No one ever looked at servants. His enemies thought him too arrogant to abase himself like this, but they always underestimated his desire for victory. He hated to be looked down upon, to be in second place, but that didn't mean he couldn't pretend when he had to. He wasn't demanded. Of course, Taija had placed anti-traveling wards around the stone. For all her failings, she wasn't completely stupid, but they did little to prevent someone like him from simply walking in. Bribes, compulsion, easy disguises. He hardly needed to be Makedian to go straight through their security, especially with the disruption to everything that came with Lews Therin taking over. When Samuel reached the door to Lews Therin's room, he paused. If the boy had Kalendor with him, then this would become a far riskier venture. He needed to be cautious. He would only strike when he could be assured of surprise, and then he could take the sangreal for himself. Hopefully the boy would be asleep. Cautiously he leaned towards the door, listening. There was someone speaking inside. Was Lews Therin alone? It was too much of a risk to go in if there were other people with him. The wrong ones would mean disaster. What if it was Taija? He cringed at the thought, and then remembered himself, bringing his face back to its normal cold composure. He'd only have one shot at this. Samuel carefully sent out inverted flows of spirit to check for any wards spun with Sedar, or less likely inverted Sedin, around the room. They found nothing, so the next step was an inverted web of spirit and air that would allow him to hear clearly whatever was being said in there. He channeled, extending the web away from him, brushing it under the door, and suddenly everything in the room was as clearly audible as if he was standing next to Lews Therin. He could hear boots pacing back and forth and a man's voice, quietly angry. He sounded like he'd been speaking for some time. Am I meant to do? I'm not ready for this. How can I be the dragon? I just want to go home. It didn't sound like Lews Therin, but the voice was unmistakable, so he continued to listen. They're all looking at me, expecting me to take charge, and I've got no idea. The High Lords, the Terns, even these black-veiled dedicated, they all think I've got answers. How can I deal with it? Burn me. He seemed to be ranting, but Samuel couldn't hear anyone else. Maybe he was alone. Taija tells me to just be myself and do my best. Tell ignored the lurch in his stomach at her name. What does she know, though? She's so centered, and all I can do is flail along as the wheel drags me where it will. Surely there couldn't be anyone else in there. This really didn't sound like Lews Therin. He was always full of himself, in control and confident to the point of offensive pomposity at times. If I make the slightest slip, the shadow wins. If I show any weakness, a High Lord will put a knife in my back and half the world will thank him for it. How am I meant to save these people? How can they be asking this from me? Lews Therin's voice rose to an agonized cry until heard a loud thump followed by a curse. The Forsaken want me dead, and I can barely even hold Sedin. Every time I do, it's like bathing in filth, and yet I want more. What am I even meant to do? I'll kill myself, or worse, someone else. Won't that be a thing, recreating the Kinslayer without even meaning to? A dark chuckle tore its way out of Lews Therin. The shadow waits for me with open arms and daggers concealed behind them, Aes Sedai seeking to manipulate me, the world against me. There was a soft thud. Tell imagined it might be Lews Therin throwing himself onto his bed. Lews Therin's voice dropped to a whisper and then started to rise. I just want to go back to the Two Rivers, see Tam, be back on the farm. I didn't ask for this. They all look at me like I'm Lews Therin Kinslayer. They don't know me. I'm not him. I'm Randall Thor. Taija's the only one who even looks at me as a person these days. But how can I live up to what she says when I'm just going to go mad and kill everyone around me, unless I can die in the last battle first? What in the light AM I meant to do? Was that a sob? Surely not. I need to be better, to do better than the dragon ever did, but I don't know how. How can I? Luz Thurin continued to rant to himself, but Tell didn't need to hear any more. He didn't want to. He let his web dissipate, the sound fading into the background. He could walk in and kill the boy right now. No one would stop him. There was no one to help Luz Thurin, and the boy was clearly incapable of doing it himself. The man he hated most in the world was at his mercy. So why wasn't he moving? His hand refusing to rise to the door handle, his feet rooted in place. Tell just felt ill, sick to his stomach. He couldn't go on like this. If he kept it up, someone was going to kill him. Whether it was one of the chosen or someone on the side of the light, he just wasn't in a fit state to fight. He needed to get out of here before someone saw him standing outside Luz Thurin's door and started asking questions. After a moment, he turned on his heel. He needed to leave. This wasn't even Luz Thurin, it was just some boy, trying to do his best against monsters like Greendel, monsters like Samil, monsters like Tel Janin. Thinking felt like wading through treacle, but as he strode as fast, he safely could towards the outside world. To get out from under Taija's wards, his mind never stopped moving. Luz Thurin and his friends working together to fight him, laughing together. Friendship, allies, trust. Horrified screams as he betrayed his own comrades. Dead eyes staring emptily up at him from corpses scattered across the broken concrete. Lined of broken slaves trooping past him. Faces filled with terrified hate from prisoners who already knew their fates. The delighted joy dancing in Greendel's eyes. Life fading from deep brown eyes. As soon as he stepped out from under Taija's wards, he opened a gateway straight to his bedroom with a snarl. Why couldn't he get his head straight? If it was still the second age, he'd have been pulled off the line by now, ordered into a period of rest and recovery. He gave a choking laugh at the idea of the shadow ever caring that much about its servants. When had he last laughed? He told himself he'd have the last laugh over the other chosen, but there was no laughter to be had. Without conscious thought, he sank to the floor, his back against the wall, not even bothering to light the lamps with the power. What was it all worth? He'd talked, ranted to Taija about the failings of the light, about revenge. What had he actually done? Ishmael lived. Lanfear lived. The shadow was as vile as it ever was. Pathetic. She was right. How could she understand? There was nothing worth understanding. He couldn't even kill Luz Thurin. Why did he even want to kill Luz Thurin? Because he'd killed Taija. He hadn't. Because he'd doomed the light with his refusal to support Tell. Tell had stabbed the light in the back. Because Luz Thurin didn't fight hard enough for the light. Luz Thurin had knowingly gone to his doom rather than surrender, unlike him. Because Luz Thurin was a better man than he'd ever been. This wasn't even really Luz Thurin. This was a frightened boy doing his best in the face of an implacably hostile world. In this age, they said no man could walk in the shadow so long he could not come back to the light. Bollocks. Some things were unforgivable, could not be justified. He'd seen it in her eyes. He was damned. There was no coming back. Taija's face seemed to hover at the edge of his vision, unbanishable. And for the first time since he'd visited Shael Gul Tel, Janin admitted it to himself, mumbling into the dark of his bedroom. I was wrong. Chapter 49. Iaido is kind of cool. Chapter text, chapter Roman 34. Iaido is kind of cool. Tell wasn't sure how long he'd spent sitting staring at the wall of the lush bedroom afforded to someone of his status. It didn't matter, though. It was like a wall had broken within him. Every small realization leading to the next. Every single one worse than the last. His whole world view shattering around him. Every little justification, rationalization broken down and thrown away. He hadn't slept all night, just sitting and thinking, then pacing and thinking, sometimes raging, sometimes calm. There were several dents in the room's carved wooden paneling where he'd punched it in his anger. He'd argued with himself, of course, repeating the same tired justifications that he had for so many years. But it all boiled down to the same thing. He'd been wrong. It was inexcusable. He didn't mean that the way he normally did, that errors were beneath him. Maybe unforgivable was a better word. The things he'd done, he was a logical enough man to understand the problem. Once you took away the foundations underlying his choices, every single one became unjustifiable. A cascade of evil. He could die 1,000 times over without redeeming himself. It wasn't until the next morning that he felt able to leave his room, and that was only to tell his majordomo to cancel all of his appointments. He needed more time to think. and after a fitful nap, that was exactly what he did. He sat and thought about the future, about what he really wanted and what he could do. Instincts ingrained by years of war and service to the shadow told him that he should use his position of power. He had Elian. He could lead the light and redeem himself defeating the shadow. That was insanity, though. A continuation of everything that he'd done wrong since the start of the war. It was just an excuse to seek more power, even if through a new route, and he'd seen where that led. He knew that what he really wanted was to go straight to Taija and throw himself at her feet, to beg for her mercy and forgiveness, to ask her for redemption, to ask her for her love once more. He also knew that it was a deeply selfish idea, one that followed on from years of selfish ideas. He'd broken her heart twice now, once when she thought he was dead, and again worse, when she found why he was alive. He'd seen the way she looked at him. She was right to. There was no way she would accept him, no way she could forgive him. He might be able to find redemption in death at her hands. Would she actually kill him? He wasn't sure, but putting that decision on her would just hurt her more. He couldn't be even more of a burden on her. She needed to think Tel Janin and Samuel were both dead and gone. Dying would be the kindest thing he could do for her. Perhaps then she could eventually move on, find someone in this age who could help her heal, help her be happy once more. The idea hurt, but it felt right. If he truly believed that what he had done was wrong, then he needed to think strategically. What was the most good that he could do? The most good he could do without delusions of leadership. If he even had a future and he suspected he didn't, he also needed to think about himself and his flaws in a way that he hated. What selfish weaknesses had led to him betraying the light? How could he reverse them? Never mind seeking absolution from others, he needed to find absolution from himself. Eventually, a plan started to come together. It would be difficult, but it would help the light. It also went against every negative instinct in him. He hated the idea of it with a passion, but that was what made it perfect. That night Tell opened a gateway to a small stone cairn in the middle of nowhere. A cairn that very, very few people knew about. On the cairn, he left a message. That was the first step. Afterwards, he slept better than he had in weeks. It was a couple of days later, when he checked the cairn, that he found a slab of stone with a few short symbols carved into it. It was just a time and a location, yet it was exactly what he'd been waiting for. Later that day, Tell stood in his bedroom, carefully adjusting his clothes. A fine green, embroidered coat of silk with just a touch of lace at the cuffs covered his top half. Brown breeches and knee-high leather boots were visible below it. Looking at himself in a reflective web of air and spirit, he tightened his belt, the heron marks clear on the hilt of the sword sheathed through it. He looked the epitome of one of the backwards nobles of this era, wealthy but not foppish. A man of action, the way Samuel always liked to look. It was fitting. Suitably attired, Tell traveled to a nondescript manor house in the Alteran countryside. The place seemed to be dead, the gardens around it covered in snow, and the building itself in dire need of maintenance. However, when he raised his hand to knock on the door, it swung open with a low creak just before he could touch it. Behind it stood an empty-eyed man dressed in black, much like one of Grendel's slaves, in fact, but without the devotion or nudity. With a low bow, the mindless man gestured for Tell to follow him. As soon as he stepped over the threshold, Tell released Sedin. Walking into this place holding the power, even with it concealed, was asking to be killed. He had no false modesty about his abilities, but here, seeing this man, well, it was a short walk to the main reception room, and the servant opened the wide doors to it with another bow. Tell strode inside, not even sparing a glance for the servant. He was beyond thanking anyway. Inside stood a bearded man with a kindly face, the sort of man who you might think should have been teaching undergraduates philosophy, at least until you saw the stream of black saw flowing across his eyes. Tell suppressed a spike of fear and the urge to turn and flee. Instead, he strode forward as Ishmael greeted him. "Samuel, I hope your request for an emergency meeting was not frivolous. I am a busy man." Even his voice was mild, trustworthy, although perhaps a bit less friendly than usual. Actually, he was holding himself oddly had he been injured. It didn't matter. "Thank you for making the time to see me, Ishmael." He kept walking forward. "I have urgent news to share. It's of the greatest importance. Something dire has happened." Ishmael's face took on a more focused look. "Tell me, Samuel." He was a paranoid madman, but he clearly felt relaxed with the true power blasting through him until carefully not even thinking about touching Sedin. Of course, it's about the dragon, rage flashed across Ishmael's face, the kindliness vanishing to be replaced by something vile. There, close enough. Tell leant forward, gesturing wide with his left hand to Ishmael's attention away. He's found. He didn't need to think. His right hand moved instinctively, a movement he'd honed with over a century of training. It was faster than thought, faster than he could channel. Fingers closed round the hilt of his sword, and he was drawing. The steel blade moving so quickly, it painted a diagonal line across his vision as it slashed upwards. Time seemed to freeze for a moment. Tell should have brought the sword down again, struck a second time, but he was caught in the moment too. Ishmael looked down from Tell to his torso, eyes widening in disbelief. Nothing seemed to have changed at first, except a thin, red line gradually widening across it. The stream of Sar in Ishmael's eyes briefly increased to a storm and then vanished. At the same time, Tell felt the man seize Sedin, a huge amount of the power, far beyond what Tell could handle. He must have an angriel. For a moment it surged through the man, his lips working soundlessly. Then he fell to his knees, blood suddenly streaming down his front, and Sedin faded once more. With a soft thump, Ishmael hit the floor face down, and Tell let out the breath he'd been holding in a long sigh of relief. He was committed now. There was no turning back. Whether he'd killed her or not, Ishmael had separated him from Taija. The first step in his fall. Revenge for that wasn't sweet. It was cold ashes on his lips, but he had made the first step. Now to continue with the plan. It was surprising for Taija how quickly the Stone of Tyr got back to a semblance of normality. The dragon's banner now flew above it, and the scars of battle still marred it in places. However, beyond that, life seemed to continue largely unchanged for its inhabitants. Well, as far as she could tell anyway, she was hardly an expert. Taija was occupying her time teaching the girls and talking with Rand. The burden of his position was clear on him. She spent time trying to support him and give him advice. Not on the politics. Frankly, she hadn't a clue there. The Terran nobles all seemed to be snakes, and frankly, she found the whole system deeply distasteful, but she couldn't say much more than that. Still, though, she could talk to him and listen to his problems, be a sounding stone for his thoughts. Alexei seemed to have come down with a nasty fever, but luckily Moiraine and Nynaeve were both talented healers and spent time with him. She was assured by them that he was in no immediate danger. Now that Taija wasn't undercover, she'd gone back to wearing men's clothes. One thing that gave her some pleasure was being in a position of sufficient wealth and power that she could order clothes designed to replicate the fashions that she used to like. The materials weren't right, but it was nice to be back in practical cheek. Leather boots, loose trousers made of thick cloth with pockets, a light silk blouse tucked into the trousers, and an open coat over them. Looks she got from the Terns irritated her, but they were more scared of an Aes Sedai than they were of her breaking of social norms. The dedicated, on the other hand, seemed to find it completely unremarkable once they found out that she was an Aes Sedai. As far as Taija could tell, they just accepted that Aes Sedai were different and could do what they wanted. She supposed there was an element of truth to that, especially in this time when might made right. As for the dedicated, they were both intriguing and confusing. Just the fact that they called themselves the dedicated was odd. She'd never had much to do with the dedicated to peace by Aes Sedai standards. Taija hadn't really needed them, and her career didn't lend itself to their services. Of course, she still encountered them during her infrequent visits to the Hall of Servants and at formal events that she couldn't avoid. However, she'd also found them a bit unbalanced. Service was vital, but it wasn't everything. People also needed to look after themselves. Not that that was an opinion she could have shared in her time without causing great offense. Regardless of that, she missed them, their songs, their compassion, the happiness they shared with their Aes Sedai. Anyway, these dedicated were nothing like those she remembered. Certainly not peaceful or subservient. Instead, they seemed to be dedicated to war. Hard-eyed and hard-bodied men and women who put her a bit on edge with the way they moved. She'd met enough very dangerous people in her life to be able to recognize them. It wasn't that they scared her, but when she wasn't entirely confident whose side they were on or what they really wanted, it worried her. One afternoon, Taija found herself walking with Ruach, not for the first time. A dedicated clan chief, he was a giant of a man, So many of the dedicated were. Taija thought he must be around 200 centimeters tall, though. It was such a difference from her own height that she felt faintly ridiculous walking next to him. She couldn't say she enjoyed how fast she had to walk to keep up either, practically scurrying. "I see you, Taija," said I. He greeted her in the way the dedicated seemed to like. "Hello, Ruark. How are you today? Is everything well?" Taija was going to feel the strain in her neck if she spent too much time looking up at him as they talked. All is well. The wetlanders continue to squabble, water still falls from the sky, and the dream goes on. He seemed mildly amused by something. Taija wasn't sure if he'd just made a joke. He'd already shown her his dragon tattoo and explained that the dedicated thought Rand was their prophesied chief of chiefs, and the other dedicated seemed to agree with him. However, beyond that, Taija had found them very tight-lipped. Whenever she'd asked them deeper questions, they'd been highly apologetic and spoken of secrets that were only for those who'd been to Ruidian. She thought perhaps Ruark might be more helpful. "Ruark, why are the dedicated called that? What exactly are you dedicated to?" When she'd asked other dedicated, they'd said that they only knew that they had failed the Aes Sedai in some unknown way and would need to atone for their sins. It was very frustrating. Some things are to be known only to clan chiefs and wise ones, Taija said. He at least looked guilty. "If you say so," she replied, struggling not to sound grumpy. "No one seems to know much of the dedicated, though." Her voice took on a nostalgic tone. "I remember the dedicated to peace. It's a funny coincidence, really, that they share a name with you. They didn't dress that differently to you either. Very different people, though." She glanced at the spears and buckler on his back. "I suppose it's a common enough word." Concern shot through her. "Are you all right? Are you choking?" Ruark managed to stop coughing. "It is nothing, Taija," said I. "Please do not worry." He definitely looked awkward, but Taija was fully into nostalgic memories and refused to be distracted by the man swallowing a fly or whatever had triggered his coughing fit. The dedicated to peace was something that could never have survived the war and the breaking, but still, they were such lovely people. "I remember once going out to the fields in spring and the songs they sang." She smiled faintly, lost in the memory. "You saw?" Ruark seemed to be speechless. Taija supposed he wouldn't really know what to say to something like that. It couldn't exist in this time. Does the White Tower have Turangriel to see? Such things. Oh, she was brought crashing back to the present by the mention of the White Tower. "I suppose it might. I don't really know." She felt bad for it, but she was annoyed at him for ruining the moment. The ways of the Aes Sedai are mysterious and should not be questioned. Her tone was clearly sarcastic, but he didn't seem to pick up on it, instead nodding firmly and quickly making an excuse to leave. Taija felt somewhat guilty for that and was in a bad mood for the rest of the day. Despite what Taija had said about its dangers, Egwene kept on finding herself in Teleranhyard. She could normally stop herself from going there when she fell asleep. Taija's advice had worked, if only partially, but she still wanted to visit it to explore her newfound abilities. So, often she simply allowed herself to walk into the world of dreams. She was fairly sure Taija hadn't meant to encourage her to visit more, but her explanation of how things worked there made everything so much easier. She still struggled to control her clothing and surroundings, it was true, but she'd made huge progress. Just knowing that it was a matter of will and focus at least gave her something to work on. With a happy smile, she focused and jumped to the two rivers. Tonight she'd see whether anything had changed back home. Somewhere in one of the finest palaces, in Ilion, a sudden, gigantic explosion ripped through Lord Brent's apartments, annihilating them utterly. No explanation could be found for it, but people muttered about dark friends and Aes Sedai plots, and thanked the Creator that through some fortuitous coincidence none of the servants had been present there. Apparently, a voluptuous blonde woman in scandalous clothing had been seen going to them, presumably for a liaison with the Lord, but no one seemed to know who she was, and it was presumed that she had perished with Lord Brend. Nothing was left of poor Lord Brend or his lover, but a number of people suddenly found themselves reconsidering their plans for both their own houses and Ilion itself, wondering why they had tied themselves to such an upstart lord. In the end, a small funeral was held for him in his palace grounds, following which everyone tried to discreetly forget he'd ever existed. Chapter 50. Can you forgive the unforgivable? Chapter text, chapter Roman 35. Can you forgive the unforgivable? While the dedicated were intriguingly odd, there was something else in the stone that captured Taija's attention. It was Moiraine that told her that there was a store of artifacts from the Age of Legends in the bowels of the stone. Taija could tell she wasn't happy revealing it to her. That woman kept secrets like they were treasure, but she thought Taija might have more luck than her in identifying what some of the Turangreel were meant to do. So one day Taija descended with Moiraine down into the depths of the fortress. She led Taija to a damp, dark room that looked like it was strewn with rubbish. When the ball of light that Taija channeled into the air illuminated it, she could see that it might once have been richly decorated and well organized, but now random objects lay haphazardly everywhere. Taija carefully picked her way through the room, glancing at what surrounded her. There must have been well over 100 items in there, but as soon as she saw it, she only had eyes for one thing, a Turangreel that she instantly recognized. A large door frame made of a red stone that seemed to twist to make a continuous edge that her eyes refused to follow. Wavy lines bedecked its sides and edges. "Do you recognize it?" Moiraine asked, a hint of impatience in her voice. Taija stared at it for a long moment. "Yes, I'd never seen it, but I recognize it." "Ilfin," she gave herself a shake. "You know of it?" Moiraine didn't answer immediately. "Yes, the White Tower has studied it. I am aware of its nature." Taija stared a little longer before tearing her eyes away. "A dangerous thing to leave unattended, dangerous for anyone who walks into it. I'm surprised it isn't better guarded. No one comes here. The High Lords despise anything to do with the power." Moiraine didn't seem to be overly interested. "What about the other items?" "Oh, yes." She'd be back for the doorway when Moiraine wasn't around. Taija started to pick her way through the room, careful not to touch anything without looking at it first. She picked up a small, intricately decorated box. This was used to make video calls, to view and speak to someone from a distance. Useless now. She kept looking. This will produce a bright light from one end if the button on it is pushed down. It should still work. Taija showed Moiraine a torch. She found a blank screen encased in a metal frame. This was used for entertainment. Imagine seeing a play whenever and wherever you wanted. It wouldn't work anymore. There was a pistol made of some kind of hardened plastic sitting on a pedestal. Clearly an officer's weapon, it was ornately decorated. Taija picked it up and sighted along it, being careful not to point it at Moiraine or anything potentially valuable. This was a miniature Sharklance. It would shoot tiny fireballs, but you needed bolts to put in it, and it's useless without them. She pointed it at the wall and pulled the trigger to the sound of a dull click. This is a mobile telephone. It was used to communicate over long distances. Taija found quite a few of those, all useless without infrastructure. She spotted a small ball made of a black metal, and while Moiraine was distracted by one of the other items, Taija slipped it into a pocket in her coat. It might come in useful at some point, and would be a neat trick to have up her sleeve. Once charged with a flow of Sedai, she could set a timer by twisting it, and then it would work as a reusable flashbang. There was a small, silvery metal rod, separated into two parts that could be twisted separately. This one's actually useful. Taija tried not to sound surprised. You can use it to create a bubble of silence, like a ward against eavesdropping, but it also blocks light and electromagnetic signals. She took a certain immature pleasure in not explaining the last two words. Many of the items Taija discarded as rubbish, nothing to do with the power or her time. She found a metal rod with a pair of probes on the end. This is more interesting. You'd use it to detect electrical activity, tamed lightning, perhaps if you were a builder. I think it would still work, but I'm not sure what you'd use it for now. As Taija progressed through the detritus of her civilization, doing her best to explain concepts that were blindingly obvious for her to someone who didn't even know what a steam engine was, she found herself getting more and more depressed. This one, I've got no idea. Moiraine didn't say anything, but Taija had said it about a few things, and she could feel her being unimpressed each time. It was actually very irritating that Moiraine seemed to expect her to know what everything was. Lots of the objects were mass-manufactured. Some of them weren't even really Turangreel in any sense beyond using the standing weaves to function or just simple electricity. But there were thousands, millions of different Turangreel, many of them custom-made. Why on earth would she know what someone's special, personal massage wand looked like. This one controls the weather in a small radius. If you channel air and spirit into it, you can charge it so it'll be useful for a few hours. The very rich would use it for garden parties to ensure good weather. I'm not sure it's got much use to it beyond that. That was a flat golden disc with clouds etched into it. Finally, Taija got to the last item. Another mobile telephone. She wondered what that said about her world, that half the remnants were mobile phones. I'm afraid that's it, Moirin, said I. There's nothing more that I can identify. She nodded graciously. Nevertheless, thank you, Taija, said I. You have been most helpful. Rand sat at the ornately carved desk in his room, staring at the piles of reports on it. Calendar was propped up against the wall. He wasn't mad yet, surely. But it was ridiculous. Everyone was looking up to him when he knew what his fate was. He laughed at the dark irony. He looked up, his laughter cut short when his door swung smoothly open on its well-oiled hinges. A servant walked in carrying a jug of wine. It was odd. He hadn't called for anything, but the ale had let him pass, so he supposed it was normal. He was still getting used to being more than just a farmer. There was a certain tension about the servant, though, something not quite right. Rand immediately reached for the power, seeking to seize Sedin, just in case. Instead of feeling the raging torrent of Sedin, he smashed into an unseen barrier. Panic spiked in him. He'd been shielded. With a snarl, Rand dived for Calendar, only for the air around him to ripple into solidity, leaving him uncomfortably frozen mid-leap. All he could do was stare at the servant fury and despair competing for dominance in his eyes. The servant met his eyes with a hard look of his own, and then seemed to waver as his appearance rippled to be replaced a few seconds later by an arrogant-looking blond man, hair and beard cropped short, blue eyes hard, and a scar torn across his face. Sedin also seemed to suddenly fill the man, presumably as an inverted web was allowed to dissipate. Samuel looked at Rand for a long moment before using his web of air to drag him back to a more comfortable position in his chair. "What do you want?" Rand spat, defiance his last weapon as he stared death in the face. Instead of the gloating or torture that he expected, Rand received an awkward shrug. "Lose th. Rand, I'm sorry. Let me know. You'll understand soon enough." He could feel Sedin raging through Samuel, more than he could possibly hold. Helpless as he was, all he could do was wait for death and watch. So he looked on with ever wider eyes as Samuel drew his sword. He could see it was a masterwork, heron stamped into the hilt. The sword came slowly out of its sheath, and Samuel held it between them as if weighing it up. Then, with a sudden, decisive movement, he turned it towards himself, hilt pointing to Rand before laying it smoothly onto Rand's desk. What are you doing?" Rand stammered. Samuel's reply was terse. "Be silent for once in your life." Rand could feel tension thrumming through the man. "You'll understand soon enough," he repeated. The Forsaken then pulled a pair of daggers from his belt, again laying them on the desk with their hilts pointing towards Rand. The scowl that Rand had come to associate with the man from their brief encounters was there as strong as ever. Then came another dagger from inside Samuel's coat, and another one from each boot, each silently placed on the table with careful, almost formal precision, although Rand was sure he could see a slight tremble in the man's hands. Finally, he reached into his pocket and pulled out what looked like a long gem-encrusted ivory tooth, thicker than Rand's thumb and almost as long as his hand. That too was laid on the table beside the sword. The amount of Sedin Samuel held felt like it diminished greatly as he put that down. Samuel then took a step back and spread his arms. "I am unarmed." His tone was flat, but with a hint of pain to his voice. At this point, Rand was left watching him with shock dominating his other emotions. There was something deeply ritualistic about what Samuel was doing. Rand wasn't sure why, but it somehow felt like a familiar pattern. Samuel met his eyes then, furious, sharp blue eyes boring into his before he suddenly looked down. Was this it? Was this when it all ended? Some sick joke for Samuel to prove he didn't need weapons to kill him? Rand closed his eyes. Perhaps death wouldn't be so bad. He heard a thump and frantically reached for Sedin. The shield was gone. He seized it before opening his eyes, drawing in as much as he could hold Bellows Angriel, a statuette of a bald, fat man sitting cross-legged and holding a sword, allowing him to hold far more than he could unassisted. Samuel had sunk to his knees before him, his eyes down and hands clenched in tight fists at his side. "Lose th. Number," Randall thought. I have wronged you. I have wronged the light, and I have wronged the world." Under Rand's stunned gaze, Samuel prostrated himself, folding over his knees so that his forehead touched the cold, stone floor. "I have committed crimes for which there can be no forgiveness. I acknowledge and accept my guilt. I can offer no defense, and I do not ask for mercy. I offer you my life, so that my blood might begin to redeem the slightest of my sins. I do not ask for forgiveness. I beg for redemption that I do not deserve." An old wording, practically ancient and achingly formal, but deeply serious. How did he know that? Rand didn't know how to react, what to do with a member of the Forsaken on his knees in front of him. In the end, all he could do was gasp out one word: "Why?" Samuel straightened up, still kneeling with his head bowed. His body language was wildly different to the arrogant confidence that Rand had seen from him the last 2 times they'd encountered each other. "I've been thinking, and the more I've thought, the worse it's been." He took a deep breath, his hands clenching into white-knuckled fists at his sides. "I don't want to try to justify myself. There is no justification. I'll just say that since I found that Taija was alive, since I spoke to her, the justifications have made less and less sense." He trailed off, sounding more like a broken, unsure man than one of the Forsaken. Rand needed to be careful. The Forsaken were manipulators, dangerous. He stood ready to burn Samuel to a cinder without warning. "Why me? Why have you come here? Why not go to Taija?" Samuel laughed, a hollow, humorless sound. "Going to Taija would have been easy. It would also have been one of the most selfish things I could do. She will never forgive me, how could she? If I offered her my life, she'd have to decide whether to take it. How could I do that to the woman I loved, still love? She's burdened with so much already. I've put my actions on top of that. Tell Janin is dead. Samuel is about to die." He sounded utterly broken. "Let her move on, find someone else who will make her happy. You still haven't answered my question." For some reason, Rand felt himself growing angrier. Every word Samuel said seemed to inflame something inside him, a mounting urge to kill the man, to make him suffer and watch him burn. "Why me?" He knew his voice was cold and distant, filtered through the void. I could have just killed myself. It would have been easy. Oblivion and an end to my shame. It wouldn't have been enough. It would have been too easy. I hated Luz Thurin, you know. Even before Taijadi left, I severely disliked the man. I thought he was pompous, foolish, and wrong about almost everything. Afterwards, I can't even describe my hate for him. I blamed him for Taija's death. I blamed him for the light's defeats. I even blamed him for my own failings. I wanted him dead, and I wanted nothing more than to do it with my own bare hands. Rand resisted the urge to recoil from the vehemence in Samuel's voice, at the same time as he tamped down on the drumbeat of rage inside him that was demanding he exact his own punishment on the Forsaken. I was wrong, though. Luz Thurin had his flaws, of course he did, but how could a man like me judge a man like him? Samuel took a deep breath, and then continued. What better way to atone for the unatonable than by submitting myself to the man I hated most in the world? I know you're not Luz Thurin, that much is clear to me now. I could have killed you 3 times in the last few weeks, and each time you showed me you weren't. What was the third time? But you're still Luz Thurin reborn. I cannot take the easy route, so I'm here offering myself to you. My life is forfeit 1,000 times over. I deserve to die. I want to die, but it's your choice. I swear under the light, and my hope of salvation and rebirth, that I will serve you and the light to the best of my ability if you so choose. Otherwise, perhaps my blood will serve to wash away some small part of my sins, and you'll have one less of the Forsaken to worry about." Samuel subsided into silence, though he was breathing heavily. He seemed to have said his piece. Rand paused for a second, studying the man who knelt there head bowed before him. Internally, he was in turmoil, raging torrents skittering across the surface of the void. It was like he felt a voice screaming for him to kill Samuel now. With a low hiss of metal on leather, Rand drew his sword. "I don't know a fraction of what you've done, Samuel, but I know enough to say there can be no forgiveness for your crimes." Rand came round the desk with slow steps, and at the same time, Samuel reached up to the collar of his coat with trembling fingers and rolled it down, exposing the bare skin of his neck. The man was clearly very brave, but terror was starting to show signs in him too. Kill him. He had to be hard. The dragon reborn needed to be able to act. Kill him needed to fight for the light. This man was so dangerous he couldn't even imagine half of what he could do. Kill him. Had committed crimes that made the worst dark friend look like a kindly grandmother. Rand stopped beside Samuel, looking down at him as the man bowed his head, fingers digging into his thighs. Rand raised the sword, hands shaking with the fury hurtling through him. "For what you've done there can be no forgiveness," he repeated the words as he brought the sword down. At the same time, he channeled. Not totally sure what he was doing, vaguely remembered webs from when he'd first fought Ishmael forming an intricate pattern around the descending sword. The razor-sharp, setting-clad blade sliced through the air behind Samuel, cutting through something Rand could neither see nor feel. But maybe there can be a chance at redemption. Rand was left standing there panting as Samuel screamed in brief, excruciating pain. Deep in the bowels of the stone Taija once more stood in the dark, dingy room of Turangriel looking up at the twisted red stone doorway. She didn't know anywhere near as much as she'd like about it, but she knew enough. She needed answers. No frivolous questions, no questions that touched on the shadow. Such simple rules, but she'd heard enough about what happened to people who broke them, whether accidentally or deliberately.